Russia's industry is in tatters.
In short, Russia has lost.
Putin has already lost.
This terrorist Putin.
Никто по существу не хотел разговаривать. Нас никто не слушал. Послушайте сейчас.
Fala, meu camarada, beleza?
Fala, meu camarada. Pegou com a limonada na boca aí.
Pra variar, tô enrolado aqui com um monte de começo de transmissão. Pessoal aí que tá no chat, estão ouvindo a gente bem? Dá um alô aí. Deixa eu só fazer um rápido adendo aqui. Tenho visto bastante comentário do pessoal pedindo as legendas dos vídeos. Então, deixa eu só explicar rapidinho. Só explicar rapidinho como é que funciona. O YouTube ele leva mais ou menos 24 horas para liberar as legendas. Então, ou eu faço na mão e não durmo, ou o YouTube faz automaticamente e depois de um dia vocês vão ter as legendas aí. Então, entre 24 e 48 horas aí. Então, o Larry Johnson já está com legenda pré-fabricada. O Andrei já deve estar com legenda daqui a 1 hora, mais ou menos. Esperamos.
A gente vai fazer uma revisãozinha também, né?
Isso depois... Porque quando vocês veem aquelas legendas amarelinhas, bonitinhas, aquilo é feito na munheca, tá? Aquilo leva 3 dias para ficar pronto. Então é isso. Então, não precisamos de apresentar. A Nina já esteve aqui no canal. Vocês já devem ter visto o primeiro vídeo que a gente fez com ela. A gente fez uma pincelada no último século, assim, bem en passant. E agora a gente vai começar a pincelar pequenos assuntos, né, para a gente tentar entender um pouquinho melhor.
Pontos mais focais, né?
Lembrando que o vídeo é em inglês, quem estiver assistindo. Então, sem mais delongas, vou trazer para vocês a Nina Byzantina.
Thank you for having me again. I
Thank you
obviously
again for
did
coming
not
back.
understand the Portuguese, so I'm sitting here
It's
like
okay.
a useful idiot that I am.
We were bad-mouthing you for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
I figured as much.
No, we're just explaining a little bit about the subtitles that they take about 24 to 48 hours to be ready on YouTube. And, hello, Nina. Как дела?
Prekrasna, thank you for inviting me back in our
Thank you.
multipolar pursuit.
Yeah.
Yes.
As we were talking about prior to going live, our dogs might join in. They're the dogs of multipolarity instead of the dogs of war. So that might create an additional soundtrack. So, but I look forward to having this conversation today.
Over here, as long as there is no one in the doorbell, I think I will be okay with my dogs.
Sure.
Yeah, and last time your dog just behaved perfectly. He just slept there and probably is going to do the same. Look, he's just looking for a place to sleep.
He's a gentleman.
He wants to tune in. He's very politically informed. He's bilingual, so he has to listen to this. Although, when dogs listen to someone speak a language they do not understand, they look really surprised. I don't know if you've ever seen that. So if I'm practicing, let's say, French or Japanese, he just looks really confused. So then you have to switch into English or Russian, and he's like, okay, things are still okay. I'm not in a parallel reality where my dog parent is, incomprehensible all of a sudden. So.
Okay.
That's true. So he speaks Russian and in English?
Yes, he's fully bilingual. He barks in dog, but he speaks. He understands.
With a little bit accent, but he speaks United States English or Canadian English?
Well, it's kind of fluid between those two. There are sort of small accent differences and perhaps expressions, but yes, he understands both. So
he barks a boot.
Yes, he barks a boot, oot and a boot. Yes, he definitely barks in a Canadian accent. Yes.
Cool. Well, great to have you back in the channel. Is our first reincidence guest. Last time we were talking about this last 100 years period of Soviet Union, then Russia, all the transitions. We were just brushing through it very quickly, and I think one of the subjects that is very interesting for Brazilians to start comprehending maybe better, or start to at least comprehend something, is one point that you mentioned during our last live stream. That was the socialism for a country that Stalin was pursuing.
Socialism in one country is sort of the official English translation, as opposed to international socialism with Comintern, that was, I guess, the original idea that was being pursued after the revolution. And I mean, it was still being pursued, just not nearly to the same extent of carrying out a global revolution. So that was sort of what we touched upon in the previous episode.
Indeed, exactly. And we have I'm gonna use the ignorance card here because I'm not a historian. I'm not well literate in history. I mean, I studied history until, I don't know, my 16 years old, and then after that, just documentaries and stuff like that every now and then. But what I saw when I had people with this kind of narrative, there was always two types of groups, two types of what we call in Brazil the iPhone socialists. Yeah. What you said, that the university guys with Soviet T-shirt and stuff like that.
Right.
And there was always this discussion that seemed extremely serious, that you had the Stalinism and Trotsky on the other side. And the thing that was interesting is that everybody was perceiving Stalin as the big demon, and Trotsky as the good guy with good intentions.
How was that when you said you're sort of, you dabbled in history, but you didn't really study it in too much detail as far as this topic is concerned? How is the subject taught in Brazil, or I guess you're also in Europe? Because that also affects, right, the way people perceive it, even these so-called insufferable iPhone socialists, if you want to call them that. Because, for instance, in North America, there's this overwhelming emphasis on the Stalinist period in the way that you described, in a sort of excessive demonization way, as opposed to looking at it in a more objective way. And then nothing else in terms of Russian history is really mentioned. I mean, there might be a specialist here and there in specific universities that would present, let's say, a graduate level course on Russian history in the 19th century. There might be a little bit of an overview of Russian history over centuries. But generally, when Russian history is taught in North American universities, the overall focus is on this very, very narrow period. It's not even on the entire Soviet Union. It's basically on the revolution, the 1920s, Stalin, through perhaps World War II. So it's a very skewed way of, looking at any country's history. And I think that really impacts the way people perceive it, even though they think, well, I'm in college now, I'm studying history in a more in-depth way, so that means I probably understand it better than a Wikipedia article. But that's obviously not true. It's very skewed. That shouldn't be the case, in regards to any country, let alone the Soviet Union. So that's why I was asking you whether it was very specialized in terms of, we're only going to look at the first half of the 20th century when we look at Russian history that's, over 1,000 years long. So.
Yeah, Davidson, you want to comment on that?
Oh yeah, well, it's if you go to the university level, studying history itself, I believe they will go very, very deep in the subject. I have a friend of mine that is a historian. He studies history in the university, and he is a leftist and take the subject in a personal way, if I may say. The impression I have is most of the people that study history in Brazil, they are kind of leftists. They are more like socialists. We have this tendency in Brazil. But the average Brazilian, he studied close to nothing about it. Just the communists were the opposite side in the Cold War, and it's basically this. If you talk about Trotsky to an average Brazilian, they probably know nothing about it. Doesn't know where he was from, what he did. They probably never have heard anything about it. So that's our point. And when they hear about it, they hear it in this romantic way, as Marcelo said, because some of these leftist guys that study history, they talk about it in a way that look like that if Soviet Union was led by Trotsky and not Stalin, then it should be working. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's more or less like this. It's more or less what I feel, at least. So
it's sort of very caricaturesque and very idealized, yes, not really looking at a very complex bureaucratic system of sort of internal issues of a new country that is being perceived as a pariah on the world stage in the first years of its establishment.
It's pretty much like an excuse, like they use it like a way out for the Soviet collapse. It's because the Soviet Union took the wrong way there.
So then how do they perceive the success of China and its ability to transition from sort of the Cold War period into today, while at least nominally maintaining the Communist Party system? What is the perception in Brazil regarding that subject?
Then you start a lot of crazy personal versions. Some people say that if Trotsky had led the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union will be close of the what now is China. Because Trotsky,
which is like the absolute opposite of what would have happened. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, but it goes to it enters in the how may I say it? The imaginary. So
sort of this like alternative history type of interpretation. And a lot of wishful thinking as well.
Yes, and that's exactly what we would like to clarify, to go deeper,
or to understand better, at least.
Yeah,
I think what's the main point in what Davidson was saying is that you have basically two groups. Which is the leftists and the rightists, the pro-communists and the pro-capitalism. And the pro-capitalism, what they say is that Stalin was the socialist concept was a complete mistake. Everything was bad. Stalin was a demon, and Trotsky was a nice guy. If he would have been the leader, maybe we would have had a lot of business together, and the country would have flourished. And in the leftist side, as Davidson said, it sounds like they use it as an excuse for the failure of the Soviet Union, which, I mean, we're talking about socialism, communism, capitalism.
The Soviet Union of the 1930s was not the Soviet Union of the 1980s. It was, two different animals, although you could sort of look at it generally and say, yes, there was still this large, bulky bureaucratic system and central planning and all that stuff, but many other features were, sort of on a lower level, more specific level. It was obviously a different country as well. So yeah, it's definitely kind of like you're saying, an idealized wishful thinking type perception to fit one's own ideological views, sort of this reinforcement of, well, I think this, and I'm going to reinterpret this, reframe it for you, so it'll sort of justify my opinions on the subject, which I mean, you see a lot of that even in actual official historiography by Western historians, Americans, Brits, et cetera, even some Russians working internationally on the history of the Soviet Union. They all sort of come at it from their own perception. So for instance, they can give you an interpretation about the development of the Soviet Union from the party perspective, from the ideological perspective, from the administrative perspective, because there was such a large bureaucracy, from sort of the factional infighting within the party, because the party, even though people from the outside think it was this monolith in the 20s and 30s, it was not. There was all this infighting. If you go back to the, Trotsky versus let's say Stalin, very sort of generally speaking, you have the right and the left within the party, with Stalin being right and Trotsky being left. So there's all of this all of these internal details that are very, very specific at the time. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting for us to understand exactly how these dynamics was happening inside the party, the Soviet Union. And also maybe outside, because in the end it sounds a lot like, even as you mentioned, that the historians on the Western Bloc, they just prefer to use this narrative and put them on the books.
Sure.
And
of course, there's also that big difference between, the Soviet Union being pretty closed off for a while in terms of giving access to its archives. And then after the Soviet collapse, all of a sudden, all this information was accessible. And historians that were the first ones to gain access, I guess now it's 30 years ago, which sounds kind of crazy that this is when they first had access to the archives. They sort of started to reinterpret a lot of the early concepts from kind of a more dumbed down, I would say, totalitarian model of the Soviet Union, especially coming from the sort of Cold War years in the United States. Like Robert Conquest, I think, is still being frequently cited by some for political purposes. Let's say in terms of the numbers of people who suffered, under Stalin, that number really, really, really went down when historians had access to actual archives, as opposed to extrapolating based on their own ideological perception. So there was also that sort of main turning point in terms of looking at Soviet history. But I mean, obviously, ideology still informs it. So people who are I hate to use the term market capitalist, because what does that even mean in today's day and age? Because it's these, giant transnational corporations that are definitely not engaging in, fair competition, et cetera, et cetera. There are governments instilling sanctions, which again is not about free market capitalism, yet people who subscribe to that ideology would be still supportive of that worldview. So yeah, ideology still informs significantly the perception of, obviously, not just the Soviet Union, but Russia today, where you still have people saying that some people saying it's a communist country, which in some ways I could say I wish it were. It definitely isn't. There are more social inequalities in Russia now than there were in the Soviet Union, and I think we touched upon that earlier too. But I guess the thing that I would start with is looking at, Marx, because Marx is the source of the ideology that, Vladimir Lenin and his colleagues attempted to instill in Russia through a revolution. And there are problems right off the bat, because first of all, Marx was a brilliant analyst of social relations. In my opinion, his analysis is still very much applicable today, even though we're in the 21st century. Seemingly, we're not living at an age of unbridled industrialization where people, children, 8-year-olds are working in factories for, 12-hour days with no safety whatsoever, et cetera, et cetera. We're living in a very different time, but his analysis of social relations, the inequality under capitalism, let's say from the standpoint of accumulating wealth in fewer and fewer hands, let's say, oligarchs. Obviously, in the West, people like to use a lovely term, billionaires, instead of oligarchs. But we might as well call them that because they do have a significant level, even of informal political power behind the scenes, not just this massive capital that they can use for their own purposes. But if you use basically Marxist analysis to examine social relations today, it's very, very apt and it's very much applicable. But Marx was very vague in terms of his timeline and his instructions for actually carrying out a revolution. Now, of course, we know he predicted such a revolution in an industrialized society, so right off the bat, Russia was not. Neither was China. So where revolutions took place was contrary to Marx's predictions, right? They took place in very agrarian societies, mostly dominated by farming. Russia was about 70-75% agrarian, rather than, let's say, Britain or Germany, that were much more industrialized. And in fact, in Russia or the Soviet Union, industrialization took place after the revolution rather than before. So right off the bat, there is that problem of we're trying to use this ideology that is vague in some ways, that doesn't really tell you what the revolution that, let's say, Marx predicted, what form it takes. Because he talked about social revolution, but he didn't really go into a lot of detail as to whether it will just happen organically, as to whether it's going to be this violent overthrow of government with a lot of bloodshed. There's not enough detail there to sort of say, okay, these are the steps that we need to use. But even if there were, the fact that you have Russia and then later China implementing this ideology in a place that's not supposed to have a revolution because it's underdeveloped, right, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes, according to his theory in terms of not being industrialized, that's a problem right off the bat. So basically then you have people sort of trying to use their own ideas rather than, while still sort of citing Marx, and trying to apply it to very different conditions in Russia. So that's one problem. The other problem is that a lot of historians would argue, and I probably would argue that too, Russia was really ripe for a revolution. And we touched upon this before, where some people, especially people who are very, let's say, explicitly anti-communist, and I really don't like when people define themselves as that. It's, I am personally not a communist, but I'm not like a pro-capitalist. I'm sort of very much for social equality and access, to things like healthcare, blah, 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 blah. So when people sort of define themselves as anti-communist, they have some specific ideological agenda, like right off the bat. And usually it's very skewed, or maybe not usually, but sometimes it's very skewed from my perspective. So basically, when they look at the imperial period, they sort of ignore a lot of the faults of the Tsarist government. They really idealize it. Because at that time, of course, Russia was perceived as more European. There were all these, personal relationships between the monarchs in Europe. There are family relationships between the monarchs in Europe. If you look at the way that Nicholas II and some of the British royalty they looked physically very similar because they were related. So there's all of that. So Russia is perceived as more less barbaric, right, quote unquote, air quotes, more civilized, more European, and all of the problems that Russia had, these people sort of try to ignore and idealize. Well, Russia was still very Christian, even though there were all these problems. Russia was slowly trying to industrialize, et cetera, which, I am a fan of looking at history in an objective way and looking at each period as it flows into the next period and looking at the benefits and drawbacks instead of sort of highlighting sort of the anti-communists essentially like to completely ignore. And there are these people in Russia too, they completely ignore the Soviet period as if it never happened, as if nothing good ever came out of it. Like of course, you can look at some of the negative features of it too, but you cannot just completely ignore such a large chunk of history because you don't like it for ideological reasons. It's just really infantile. And so, yeah, basically there's that perception that the Tsarist period was this absolute paradise on earth, which of course it wasn't. It had some positive features, but there were very significant social inequalities. Otherwise, a revolution in Russia would not have happened. And there's some, I hate to use the term conspiracy theorists because a lot of times so-called conspiracy theories, as they're dubbed by the mainstream media, are actually right. But in the case of, the revolution only happened because Germany, and London funded Lenin, and otherwise nothing would have come about. I mean, that's just really, once again, really primitive. There had to have been a really serious foundation within sort of the society itself that was unhappy for many different reasons to actually spill over into such a large and violent event as a revolution in a large country like the Russian Empire. So, for instance, if you look at classes, Russia didn't quite have classes at the time, let's say in the 19th century, 18th century, in the Western sense of in industrialized society, where you have like the middle class living in cities, you have the lower class workers, right, living and working in factories for 14-hour days without any kind of social protection, et cetera, being paid in peanuts. So it didn't really quite have that. I mean, yes, there was sort of this developing urban class in large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, but there was this older concept, in Russian it's called soslovia, which does relate to, basically, I guess it's almost better to translate it as the French term estate, like in the French like in France, right? You had estates, different levels. And so it's almost better to translate it as that, because there's more packed into soslovia than just class. There's hereditary, aristocratic features, land ownership. There are sort of socio-cultural features of what certain classes, right, estates in Russia could and could not do. There are regional differences. So it's much more complex than the way we perceive class today. Oh yeah, this person is lower class, right? This person is working class, this person is middle class, this person is, upper class, and this is like the billionaire oligarchs, right? So it's a lot more complex. So even after, in the latter part of the 19th century, the Tsars started to implement reforms. So for instance, they got rid of serfdom, do I need to explain what serfdom is? I think most people probably kind of know what that is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when they got rid of serfdom, all of these social structures still remained in place because it was deeply ingrained into Russian society. That's why you had so much instability in the 19th century, assassination attempts on the Tsars, actual assassinations of the Tsars. You had multiple terrorist groups, you had anarchists, you had different types of socialists. So Russian society, from the political standpoint, was very fluid and unstable, starting from at least the second half of the 19th century. You could probably go to the 1840s for that. So you have that is being unresolved heading into the 20th century. And then, of course, you have a first attempt at a revolution, the failed revolution of 1905, when Nicholas II, who was, I'm sure he was like a nice man. In my opinion, he was a very weak Tsar, not really fit for government of such a large country. But he cracked down on that revolution, and none of those issues were resolved. And then he sort of backtracked and tried to come back, and he instituted the Russian version of a parliament, the Duma, to have a little bit more representation than before. But a lot of that was a little too late. And then, of course, all of those things were being compounded, and bam, World War I. So imagine people who are just very unhappy and poor and do not have basic necessities like food. They're now being sent to the front to be slaughtered, repeatedly in this really strange conflict. 3 weeks prior to the war, you have Nicholas writing to his sort of family members on the opposite side of the barricades, dear Nicky, dear Willie, right, to each other. And then the war breaks out, and it's not, well, they literally refer to themselves as Nicky and Willie, right? Very kind of nice family, right? Family names for, because they're related. And they're not the ones that are being slaughtered at the front somewhere in the trenches, and I have sort of family stories of one of my, I don't even know what the English would be. It would be like the great grandfather's cousin, like that type of situation, who was stuck in a swamp hiding from the Germans. and he was shot. And he was shot in a way that he wasn't able to have children after that. So you can imagine where he was shot, as he was hiding in the swamp for a few days. So I have stories from World War I like that, which is really interesting to me. So you can kind of see these lower classes that were serving in the army for a long time just to basically have basic necessities and money to survive. That really compounded. That was sort of a huge turning point for that social instability and unrest. So of course, when you have the Bolsheviks coming in and promising bread and peace, very, very basic things that a lot of people can relate to, that is a message that resonates. Now, that's not to say that everyone supported the Bolsheviks. That's why there was a civil war. It was very bloody. There were multiple factions, right? There was the White Army. There was sort of infighting within the White Army because some of those generals, former leaders in the Imperial Army themselves wanted to be in control. They were cooperating with the Western powers plus Canada, US, Japan, right? They also wanted a piece of Russia when they sort of did their little intervention, which, I call it the first Western, I wouldn't really say it's a successful invasion of Russia, but they definitely entered and they worked with the whites, but they also had their own objectives in terms of natural resources and so on and so forth. So this is a very, very, very complex situation. But basically the takeaway here is that there was really, really fertile soil for a revolution for many, many reasons, which is not to say that everyone supported it, which is not to say that some people, even at lower levels, didn't fight against it, right? But it was not just this thing that, Lenin came with funding from London, he snapped his fingers, and all of a sudden, there's this new government with this evil conspiracy of, left-wingers, because that's what the, evil Londoners wanted. So, which is not to say that I'm a fan of the British Empire, but it's, you really kind of have to look at this in perspective. You can compare this to today. If you look at, going back to Ukraine, there were, 2 attempts, one successful at regime change in 2004, the Orange Revolution, and the Maidan in 2014. And you cannot say, now, of course, yes, there was foreign funding coming from the outside. There was 20 years at that stage of funding NGOs, pro-Western, anti-Russian media, blah, blah, blah. But you still had some people who were supportive of these protests. You cannot have a protest without anyone supporting them, right? So this is obviously kind of a microcosm of something that's much greater. But whenever you look, let's say, at the color revolutions of today, or let's say the late 20th century going into the 21st century, there has to be something, some kind of fertile soil for that protest to actually take off. Now, you could say it's easy to find something that people are unhappy about because there's no perfect country. So, of course, if you go back to Russia of, the 1910s, there are lots of things to be unhappy about. And World War I is the thing that compounded it. I'm now going to shut up for a moment. If you have any questions, let me know.
That's the idea. That's the idea.
That's the idea. I mean, you can't. When I'm just paying attention. I'm keeping my mouth shut so I don't interrupt you for a second.
I'm just curious whether you do have any questions about World War I or about, the social structure or in the sort of the late imperial period before the revolution broke out, whether you have any questions that would perhaps help clarify the situation, why there was a revolutionary situation at the time to your audience. So that's my point. Other than me, blah, blah, blah.
That's blah, blah, blah as much as you wish here. This is pure gold. No, one point that you mentioned that I think is very interesting, very important in this case, is how weak Nicholas was. Because, if he was a strong monarch, or Tsar in that case, he would just have, suppressed the revolutions and killed everybody or whatever, because we saw that in Brazil. And that's one thing that we see, we talk a lot about between ourselves, is that the Portuguese monarchy and later on the Brazilian monarchy was very astute, very, very intelligent to understand what was about to happen before happening. So, for example, Brazil has its independence peacefully. The son of the king of Portugal just came out and say, okay, independence or death.
Right.
Okay, death to whom? To your father, to yourself? You know,
there's a very, very famous phrase in this matter, in the Brazilian independence, that the king, Dom João the Sixth, he come to his son and say, go there and declare independence before an adventure take the opportunity, you know?
Yes, exactly.
And it's very, very famous, you know, and then it is between them. It's a family business. Brazil follows connected to Portugal by blood.
And before we had the Portuguese Empire, then it became Brazilian Empire under the same people. So they were very intelligent on that. And I think they were very intelligent as well when it comes to the Republic Declaration. I mean, the end of monarchy. It just looks to me that, and the end of slavery as well. So who ended the slavery was the daughter of the king. So, I mean, you see people that are doing their business, that slavery is it's a monarchy business everywhere. A business everywhere. And when you see these people breaking their own business, you see that something
digress, that's something significant.
Something's fishy there.
Something very bad might happen to you, so it's probably better to make some concessions.
But you can see the same thing happen in the United States under a bloody war. Here in Brazil was from one day to the other, the slaves were kind of free, you know, they were free. Right.
Yeah, that's also just quickly talking about, this is a point that everybody always says that, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery. Yeah, it's true. But I mean, it was the last. I mean, if it was the 1 minute later last, it would be the same. They would say the same, you were the last by 1 minute. But in fact, in reality, it was more or less 30 years difference from the United States, for example.
Well, I think it's interesting when Britain likes to claim that it ended slavery earlier than, let's say some other countries, but at the same time, you still had these colonies that had this indenture system for workers, let's say, who could not leave when they were transferred, let's say, to the Caribbean from other places. And so maybe the actual formal slavery was gone, but that extreme social inequality that would push people to do this type of work to the point where they were unable to leave. They had contracts that were being renewed. So all of that continued. So I feel like when you're claiming the formal, I mean, even if you go to Russia, right, the getting rid of serfdom, but a lot of that informal inequality was still in place, right, for decades. And so it's definitely a process, right? It's not this instant talking point. We did this first. So just for me to be completely clear about this, when you talk about serfdom, you actually talk about some kind of slavery. Well, they were not
with a different name.
It's a medieval serfdom, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a mutual relationship between a landlord that owned land and a peasant, a farmer that did not. So there was that exchange for service, for access to land, to grow crops. Obviously, a lot of it would go to the landlord. So very generally speaking, it's like the medieval system. Now, of course, there are differences in other countries. Japan had kind of like a more paternalistic relationship between the lord and the serf. But generally speaking, it's that system of kind of a mutual relationship, obviously very, very unequal. But a lot of these serfs would be passed down to, basically as inheritance to the next aristocratic family member, and they would be doing other work. They would be doing basic household duties in the house. So they were, I think you can compare them to maybe not quite slavery, but definitely it's a highly unequal relationship. And there were different levels of serfs too. There were sort of some regional differences as well, but clearly that was not a system that was going to survive into the modern age. So in that sense, the Tsars that Alexander, right, the second that ended it, had the right motivations. But again, there could be an argument made that a lot of it was either a little too late or it didn't go too far. So it's like, what's next? Now there's no more serfdom, but where do they get the money to have their own land? Like, what do they do? How do they survive? So, and then it was really dependent, right? It was really dependent on specific regions, relationships with their former landlords, et cetera, et cetera. So that change was very, administratively, it was very slow. Socially, it was slow. So there was that decision, right? But then after the decision, what happens? And that argument could be made, as you're saying, about slavery in different countries. So there's definitely that parallel. And it's interesting, right? Some people compare the fact that the US, right, ended slavery in the 1860s and Russia ended serfdom, right, in 1861. So there's a little bit of that parallel too, how that was changing sort of simultaneously, so to speak, at least formally. So,
yeah, and in Brazil case, it was a process. It was a slow process as well, because the slavery ended in 89, 88, right? 88. In 1888. But before that, there were different small steps. So you had the 60-year-old law, which means that people older than 60-year-olds would be free. The slaves older, the free which means that newborn babies were born free.
Right.
They were born free. And plus, slightly before, we had the Paraguayan War, where much like the United States Civil War, the slaves were like a payment. If you have slaves and you don't want to send your son to the war lines,
yes,
you just pay X slaves to fight, and they actually they play a very important role in that war.
Yes,
so,
you can make the same argument about serfs and sort of lower level peasants going into the Russian army in the 19th century, late 19th century, because that was a pathway to survival and having a little bit of money by serving the state and possibly sacrificing oneself. So that was definitely one. Well, I mean, the military still is today, right? In different countries, it's a way if you look at the US, right, it's the way for sort of the poor to get college, which is definitely not free, very expensive. So it's still kind of a system that is supposed to help in exchange for your service with possibly your life, right? So
yeah, that's true. But trying to come back a little bit to the Trotsky Stalin stuff, we were talking about a little bit about George Orwell and Animal Farm. That was we also brushed about this in the last video, and we had some comments actually. People, kind of smearing, the George Orwell was an idiot and Animal Farm is a baby book and stuff like that. But the fact is that in Animal Farm and also in 1984, Orwell portrays exactly what we were talking about, more or less. You have the pigs. What's the name of the pigs? I never remember which one is which. Napoleon and Snowball.
Yes. Snowball and Napoleon. Napoleon was the one that seized power, and Snowball is put away. In that, if I may, Marcelo,
sure, go ahead.
Okay, it's very interesting, and that's something that I would like to point out, because Snowball is the one that say the farm should take care of itself and show the world the way by example. And Napoleon, the one that seized power, is the one that wants to invade or influence or spread the news to the other farms and you know, and make the other farms start their revolutions by his command, by his influence.
So this is like Trotsky versus Stalin parallel.
But inverted. Yeah. But it is inverted. Because there. Sorry,
multiple dogs. Hello.
And that's inverted because in the real story, the one that sees power is the one that wants to take care of his own business. No, the communist one country. And the one that was put away is the one that wants to spread the revolution around by influencing the other farms. It's more or less like this, right?
Well, there's also an argument that those books are more about the West than they are about the Soviet Union. So you can always go down that other rabbit hole. But yes, basically, let's say the revolution in Russia was a success. And you can imagine it's a bloody civil war. At this time, the Bolsheviks used the system of what they call the war communism. So they were requisitioning grain from farmers to fund basically this very basic battle. They had a barter system because they were not even using money in some places. So things really regressed, right? And because this is a state of war. And so obviously, once the revolution was successful, how do you manage this new society? So of course we go back to that issue of, well, Marx didn't really talk about an agrarian society, sort of living post-social revolution. It was an industrialized society. So what do we do right now for basic survival? Let's leave ideology aside. So Lenin, he died quite early. He died in 1924, but starting from 1921, they implemented what was called a new economic policy, which was basically this, roughly speaking, mix of socialism and capitalism. So there was this ability to have private businesses in non-vital sectors. So basically the government took control of, let's say, the industries, like heavy industries like mining, finance, et cetera, things that are vital to the state. But other industries, let's say in like the food business, beer, for instance, candy, sort of non-vital things, food, et cetera, people could still have a private ownership. So again, that's one of the things I think a lot of people do. A lot of people who are not interested in Russian history do not know about the Soviet Union, that there was this period of sort of mixed economy. And this was basically a practical solution to, we don't want to completely go broke. We just had a bloody civil war. We need to get money from somewhere. We need to build back up. And so the Soviet Union also allowed concessions, mining concessions, for instance, for foreigners to come in and take advantage of Russia's natural resources. So there was this really strange period in the 1920s up until 1928 of this mixed economy that on the one hand, the state was controlling much of it. On the other hand, you still had private ownership and you had a lot of foreign powers participating in sort of building the economy back up in exchange for access to Russia's rich natural resources. And ideologically, some Bolsheviks explained this as primitive socialist accumulation was the term that they used. Basically, we need to accumulate some resources and finances before we can industrialize because we are an agrarian society. So at this time, right there, especially after Lenin's death, Lenin didn't leave very clear instructions as to who the next leader would be. Some people would argue that he passed on that leadership to Stalin. There was nonetheless a lot of factional infighting. So what I refer to, there was that split within the Communist Party between the left and the right. Again, people outside of Russian history, or perhaps who do not study it to this degree, they perceive it as this monolith. There is this, evil totalitarian Communist Party that makes decisions and everyone agrees and there's no disagreement, then they clap for 30 minutes. That was not the case. There was a lot of infighting. Stalin was sort of on the right, so to speak, of the party, and people who would be aligned with Trotsky and other like-minded individuals in the party were on the left. And so there was this debate. What do we do next? We need to industrialize. This primitive socialist accumulation is too slow. We're not industrializing fast enough. And on top of that, think of foreign policy. Sometimes when people look at Soviet history, they completely ignore what's going on around the world. So you have this new state with this new ideology that's being perceived in a hostile way by much of Europe and the United States. It is being unrecognized. So for example, the United States didn't recognize the Soviet Union as an actual political entity until 1933. So for, let's say, from 1917 until 1933, the Soviet Union is unrecognized by that one country, right? And then you can make similar parallels with other countries. So of course, there's a lot of paranoia, feelings of weakness. We just had a very bloody civil war. So there is a lot of concern about foreign interventions, foreign invasions. There is like a war scare in the latter part of the 20s. So that makes the concept of we need to industrialize really fast much, much, much more pertinent. And so someone like Stalin wanted to implement a more rigorous system of industrialization. And how do you fund it, right? You fund it through farming because our country is mainly agrarian. So you create this connection, right, between industry and farms. The term that they used was switchka, which means like a connection. Basically, it's kind of an old way of describing it. But someone like Trotsky, who was sort of like the hero of the, you know, the original Red Army, et cetera, he vastly disagreed with the right-wingers in the party, and he wanted to follow a different course. And exactly what you guys mentioned earlier on, he also wanted to emphasize that international aspect. We still want a global revolution. We want to influence it not just by example, but directly through the Comintern, right? The International Communist Organization, et cetera, whereas Stalin, once he actually came to power in the latter part of the 1920s, he officially announced socialism in one country. We're going to be going inward. We're going to be focusing on ourselves, which is not to say that the Comintern disappeared, but definitely it was sort of put on the back burner, at least in the concept of, you know, the Marxist global revolution that should sort of go all around the world once the first country, right, the Soviet Union, Russia, had its own revolution. So that was sort of, very generally speaking, the major change in the 20s. And then, of course, we could look at culture. Russian society was very socially conservative. Now, obviously, the Slavs were Orthodox Christians. You had the Caucasus who were Muslim, right? You had other religions because the Russian Empire was so vast. So you have this very socially conservative traditional society, and then someone like Trotsky and his allies come in, and all of a sudden, you know, they legalize abortion, they start banning religion, they some thinkers like, let's say, Alexandra, I always wonder, should I say it the Russian way? Should I say it with an American accent? Let's say Alexandra Kollontai, she was for, you know, free love and no marriage, let's abolish marriage. So very sort of things that we hear today in the 20th century. So this shocks people today, or shocks some people today. So imagine being a very religious conservative society in the 1920s, and this is being shoved down your throat. It's absolutely shocking. So what happened, so this was sort of, again, very roughly speaking, the camp of Trotsky, sort of the more left-wing Bolsheviks wanted to continue implementing these ideas because they perceived, let's say, marriage as a bourgeois concept, and they wanted to get rid of that. So they wanted sort of to achieve this, I guess, overall equality as well. But with Stalin, he was, of course, a very shrewd politician. I mean, you can also probably make a personal argument because he was a son of a priest, so there probably was some social conservatism, even though he was kind of a very hyper-individualist, right? You're not going to become a revolutionary and a rebel and use aliases and hide and, you know, in Vienna, unless you're like really, really individualist and a rebel. But there's definitely, you know, he's a Georgian, he's a had that social conservative background. So what happened in the 1930s is that he basically ended up canceling a lot of these advancements, again, air quotes, socially wise with today it's still called the Stalin Constitution of 1936. So he basically backtracked on a lot of the things. So he ended up actually banning abortion. He ended up, at least in terms of, let's say, state propaganda, he started reinforcing the concept of a strong marriage. Later, especially after World War II, there was a lot of this natalist advertising. Well, obviously the Soviet Union lost, 27 million people, so they needed to increase the birth rates, but that happened within the promotion of a traditional family structure and a mother that would have a lot of children. At the same time, even in the 30s, the concept was that women are, of course, equal to men, they can work in factories, et cetera, but women should definitely still be having children, and the state will help you with this. The state will give you a really long maternity leave. The state will give you free daycare. The state gives you amazing free healthcare. And if you actually look at statistics, we sort of touched upon this a little bit in our first episode, first discussion. We talked about the fact that the Soviet Union had amazing successes in terms of getting rid of childhood mortality, basic diseases that were not eradicated under the late imperial government, et cetera, et cetera. So their literacy went from being quite low in the Slavic part of the empire to actually being almost reaching 100% very, very quickly. Electrification of the countryside. So all of these things that we're taking for granted today, like having lights and being able to read books and being able to go to the doctor and being able to give birth, fairly safely. All of those things were introduced very rapidly in the Soviet Union. If you go to Western historians, you're going to find those statistics. They begrudgingly admit that the Soviet Union was very successful in this regard, in terms of introducing a lot of social sort of safety networks, basic necessities, and basically the type of stability that a large part or most of the population did not have in the late imperial period. So
yeah, that's an interesting point. We have, for example, when I moved to Europe, it was very difficult for me to explain to an European what basic sewage means. Because, it's a problem in Brazil. It's a problem today, 2023. Oh, yeah. We just had the most famous comedian in Brazil. I don't know what happened to him. He decided, he made a hell lot of money, and then he decided to go boxing, and then he had a boxing with a Brazilian champion, and I think it hit very hard.
He was a world champion. He's a Brazilian world champion, Mr. Popó.
Sounds like such an awful idea, right off the bat.
It's like if me getting in a fight with Mike Tyson or something like that.
Right.
And I believe it hits him a little hard. But the truth is, well, he's a comedian. He's very good at it. He's a very good comedian. And the last show he made, it was a very politically activist. Okay, not politically activist in the way that's mirroring this party and talking good about that guy. No, his show was about basic sewage, basically. And although very funny, it was also very, very intense.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's hard. So when you say things like, oh yeah, things that we think granted, some of us, it's hard to tell Europeans that things that are granted, well, somewhere else they're not.
They're not.
And they're very basic, very basic.
It's very easy to check. If you go to Google Maps and you zoom over Rio de Janeiro, one of the biggest cities in Brazil, one of the biggest cities in South America, very famous city. If you zoom Rio de Janeiro, you will see Guanabara Bay. Guanabara Bay is one of the most polluted water bodies that I have ever seen. It's black. You see the color of the bay in the Google Maps.
It's dark brown.
Right.
It's dark brown,
Gosh.
and
Yeah.
you see the ocean. It is blue. You know, it is, and the polluted water goes inside the ocean,
Into the
a few
ocean,
kilometers. You know, it is unbelievable. All of it is the sewage of 15 million people.
I think it's 9. I think it's about 9.
If you take all the metropolitan area around the bay, it's about around 15. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. A lot of people. And there's no sewage treatment at all.
Yeah.
Zero. And in Europe, people don't understand it. They don't.
Well, this is the same thing with explaining healthcare, let's say in Canada or Europe or Russia or China or Japan to Americans who, especially if they're more conservative minded and might be good on some social issues, they get very up in arms that you're stealing their money. God forbid, should you have very, very basic health care coverage. And I think I've mentioned, you know, I've had the experience of living in 3 countries, so I can kind of compare. And I used to be very critical of Canada because it had a very long wait, which it does in some cities. But when you have in the US with insurance that you pay for every month, bills into tens of thousands of dollars for a day surgery where you were in a hospital for maybe 2 hours. And in Canada, you never had to worry or even consider this sort of thing. And Europe would be the same. I think from what I understand, European healthcare is probably even better than Canada. Canada has been going downhill a little bit. But it's one of these things where there's no concept of what that would be like. So this idea that I, who grew up in other places, take for granted, like this is a sign of a healthy society. The term civilized is very loaded, but I think if we talk about healthcare and sewage, you can talk about civilization maybe in this regard, not any political ideologies, right? Sure. Yeah, to me, this is a sign when you have people from especially lower social strata, but who are not dirt poor, like in the US, if you're dirt poor, you have access to Medicaid, right? But otherwise, if you're sort of just above that, it's like, oh, too bad. You're going to be paying, you know, this and this and this. So it's like this thing that people in many, many other places take for granted is not taken for granted. And I had this conversation with a Chinese person in China, and they were just absolutely shocked because they said US is such a rich country. Why do you have to pay for the ambulance? You know, so it's the same thing. Yeah, you can go to sewage, you can go to other concepts. So yeah, if you go back to early 20th century Russia and think about, you know, the lack of electricity, not being able to read books, being able to do basic math with, you know, things that basically let you make your own decisions. It's really staggering how much was achieved in that really short period. So that's why Western historians begrudgingly admit that the Soviet Union was quite successful in that regard, in terms of just really bringing up the standard of living for the majority of the population. Now, of course, the people, you know, more aristocratic people who were sort of in the positions of power, upper echelons of society, yes, they went down. They, you know, some of them were, I would say, unjustly perceived as perhaps class enemies in certain contexts because they were highly positioned. But you can sort of maybe not justified, but understand why they were perceived in this way, because other people were much, much, much more poor, and through no fault of their own, other than the actual social structure that enabled that type of social inequality. So yes, most people rose up in terms of their standard of living, but people who were more privileged went down. So that's probably not surprising after a revolution.
Oh yeah, of course.
Exactly.
Of course.
I'm sorry that I just had to come here for a second because Instagram streams for an hour and stops without telling me anything.
Yeah, I remember that.
So I just have to restart it.
You mentioned the Soviet Union trying to promote equality among women and men, and saying the women that they should do everything the men do, and even so, you need to have child, so the government will help you. It's more or less what they want to prove, or to use like an example with the night witches, right? The light bomber squadron in World War II, made only by women.
Yes.
Heard about it? So
Yeah.
they had this light squad, the night bombers, made only by women. All the members were women. The mechanicals, the gunners, the pilots, navigators, everybody, the commanders, everybody, they're women. And they use it like propaganda for quite a long time.
Yes. Well, of course, female snipers in World War II as well. I mean, there is that sort of promotional, if you'd like to say, propagandistic aspect, but at the same time, I consider it sort of more positive propaganda, because there are much more worse things that you can be advertising, which is not to say that, all women should just go and work in factories and try to compete with men for strength, because they probably will fail in most cases. But the fact that you now had women with access to the types of professions, again, not necessarily in factories, but let's say in science, I don't think that if I look at my family history, a part of my history, it's interesting. This is kind of shows you, when you look at individual people's family history, it shows the revolution as this great equalizer, because I have one part of the family that were farmers, and I don't think they were like poor farmers, at least from what I understand. I haven't ever looked at archives. This is just what I've been told, right, by family members. So it sounds like they were doing well, but they were farmers, so they didn't have formal education. And, this is sort of where my father came from, very, very small village, grew up in the countryside. So, thanks to the Soviet Union, he ended up moving to Moscow, receiving his PhD in biochemistry. And we talked a little bit about my dad earlier, that he was then this sought after specialist in Canada, US, and he actually had a choice of where to go. So that kind of shows you that a person whose family didn't have that formal education actually had, the intelligence to be able to pursue sciences if that were this person's interest, and if the society in which this person lived, right, allowed for that to happen. At the same time, if I look at my sort of maternal line, they were sort of city people. They were more middle class, maybe upper middle class. So again, very different. And I have, for example, a great grandma who was able to go and study in Paris in university, right, before the revolution. So that tells you that this person is pretty well socially positioned to be able to afford to go to a foreign country. And at the same time, it's pretty cool that she is a woman and she was able to go and at least partially get that education in Sorbonne, right? Like, it's a very famous university.
Wow, yeah.
She didn't finish it. I think she came back either for family reasons or because of the war, World War I, right? But you do have some examples of women doing this, but of course, this is very exceptional. This person was, more better socially positioned than, let's say, someone on my father's side of the family who were farmers. They were working the fields. They were not taking the train to Paris, right? So very different. So that type of, I think, the ability to be able to actually pursue your interests and contribute while you're still fulfilling your biological role. And I know some people who are sort of very 21st liberal progressives, 21st century minded liberal progressives would hate me saying that I talk about the female biological role, but ultimately, we're animals. We are.
No, it's okay. They are unable to tell what a female is, so.
Yeah, but some people in universities are not.
Yeah, I mean, I am, by current Western standards, I'm socially conservative, right, when it comes to culture and society, family, but I'm also left wing, again, for the lack of a better term, when it comes to economics. So I think people, let's say in Canada, or maybe let's say the US, right, where they have very strictly delineated parties. And if you're sort of supporting, let's say, the Democrats, you only have these ideas, you cannot stray outside. Now, obviously, there are people people who are more individually minded who would. But if, let's say I'm speaking with an American who is a Republican, and I'm not talking about cultural issues, they would be agreeing with me. But the second I mention free healthcare or the state funding certain social programs, I am this, evil leftist. So they can't quite compute how those two can fit in one person's brain, because it's very, I would say that not obviously, again, there are exceptions to the rule, but for the general population, they really follow the party line in this regard, right? So
there's a comedian, an American comedian, Chris Rock. I think in his first I'm a fan of comedy, so I will talk a lot about comedians because I do think they have some pretty good ideas, some of them. And one of his big shows, he says about that. He said that it's stupid to say what you are, to put yourself in a box like I'm leftist, I'm rightist, I'm Democrat, I'm Republican, whatever, communist, capitalist, if you have not been presented with the question yet. So his point is, and then he makes a joke about it, like, I don't know, weed, I'm leftist. Abortion, I'm rightist. Right. He says his things, but that's one of the main points. I mean, people get what you say. You are Republican. You have to follow republicanism.
That dogmas. They put it like dogma.
Yeah, like a religion, as Davidson said, like a religion with dogmas and everything. And, well, what you just said about yourself is that, well, I'm someone that thinks about for a second before answering.
Well, I am someone with common sense.
Not common,
me,
some reason.
What the Soviet Union had was also kind of a if we want to use the term feminism, right, for women, it's a much more positive version of feminism, because women were able to fulfill themselves professionally if they wanted to, right? And at the same time, they were able to have the family of the size that they wanted while having, free daycare, very long maternity leave, being able to have very long vacations, et cetera, having all these perks of state-funded help and having the stability to be able to do that. But at the same time, sharing these kind of more socially conservative, again, quote unquote, traditional family values. And this is something that, even though Russia today is a very different society, it's definitely something that has carried over into Russia. So if you were to look at any street interviews with, let's say, Russian women on these subjects, they would mention both of those things. They would mention that they do want to have some sort of professional fulfillment, and at the same time, they want to have a family, which I think is a nice balance. Now, I know a lot of Western conservatives will say, oh, she's wasting her time. She's working in HR. That is such a waste of, that is just a waste of her life. She should be home for the, with the children, doing homeschooling, et cetera, which is really extreme. But, but let's say they can afford to, she can afford to stay home because the husband makes sufficient income. She can also, be fulfilled in other avenues. She can do some kind of volunteering, et cetera. But anyways, going back to that, the type of feminism we have in the West today is much, much less healthy, and it's more focused on symbols rather than actual factual, practical types of issues that actually do impact women and would make a difference, versus what we had in the Soviet Union, where there was a pretty nice balance between, again, women trying to have a family, fulfilling their maternal instinct, being able to have a family with multiple children. Again, going back to the Soviet Union, women had families with, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, children. Today, the Russian birth rate, even though Putin has been putting a lot of effort into bringing it up from the dismal situation of neoliberal hell of the 1990s, it's still around 2 children, right, per family. So if you're concerned about demographics and you look at it from the standpoint of, we need to have this many people, we need to have this many taxpayers, which is also kind of a loaded thing, it's a separate discussion. The Soviet Union was more successful in this regard than modern Russia.
Indeed. So, the night witches example that I mentioned, I think it's excellent to show it up, because those women, they before the war, they were studying physics in the university in Moscow, and then they went to fight a war, piloting planes, bombing the Germans, and most of them were mothers. Actually, they left their kids at home with their grandmas to fight a war.
Yes.
So I can't see
you can't see modern Western feminists leaving their non-existent children, their dog children or their cat children.
Not at all. Not at all. You know, we don't need to say anything else. Just study this history of those women, and you understand what it should be.
Yeah, and you certainly have those types of values outside the West, where women, I mean, you can talk to, some people, let's say some women from Lebanon who are religious, they would cover their hair. At the same time, they're very professionally accomplished. At the same time, they have 3-4 children. So they reach, to me, that's really inspirational because they're doing exactly what I think women should be doing. Women who are intelligent, they do have, not every single woman is interested in being, a PhD in science or whatever, but those who are, and at the same time, they want to have, they want to have a family. To me, as a woman, that is very inspirational. I normally don't think of it as like, oh, women, I really side with women's issues. In fact, I prefer to communicate with men, and I always have. But as a woman, from that perspective, that's definitely very inspirational to me, where you see women sort of having these fairly traditional ideas about family and children, et cetera, but being accomplished in sort of the public sphere. And to me, a woman who is happy is going to be much more unfulfilled, right? Is going to deliver better for the family and the children. And she's going to be fulfilled as a mother. She's going to be fulfilled in some kind of a public role. Again, it doesn't have to be a PhD in science. It could be volunteering, but something in the public realm, right? She is just going to feel so much more content and deliver more to her family. I mean, to me, it's just such common sense, but it seems to be we've lost a lot of that common sense for those of us who do reside in the West and have to sort of recalibrate and unplug and, rethink of what is being shoved down our throats. So
I was just thinking here for a second, when you said this conservative aspects, and then you say women having babies and families, and I was since when did it become conservative to that's
basically society to go forward and not die out? Like when has that become?
Yeah, I mean, let's just for a second pretend that we still remember that we are just animals. Mammals.
Exactly. Yes.
I'm not saying in a bad way. We're mammals. Let's just remember for a second that that's our basic instinct.
Yeah, basic function.
It's to function like that, and it's very interesting. It just came to my mind while we were talking. When did it become being conservative?
No, the fact that I have to qualify it for the audience, should anyone hear and feel offended, it does say a lot.
Sense,
and obviously we don't want to offend people who are unable to have children, or for whatever reason they do not want to. They shouldn't be pressured into that. But at the same time, the fact that I still think there should be a healthy promotion of natalism in society, that children are good, that families are good. Now, of course, there are all kinds of exceptions and things are imperfect and people get divorced, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that we now have to qualify that having a child is this bizarre, choice as opposed to a very natural thing that animals, including human animals, do. Yeah, it puts things into perspective, and it's not a good perspective.
Exactly. It's weird, actually. I just saw a question here that it caught my attention. So can we say that Putin is a modern Leninist? And I will let you answer this but just before, I would like to make an argument. When you say these things about the post First World War, Second World War, when the Soviet Union Soviet Union needed to pump the birth rate and repopulate some things when the SMO started, I'm just, it had nothing to do with this video, but I would like to ask this point. When the SMO started, we started to see several things that Putin was doing. Well, Putin, the Kremlin, the government, several actions that they were doing, like moving the economy to a war economy slightly. They were not propagandizing it as a war economy, but you could see the movements, like some laws passing. Well,
I mean, to me, it's so remarkable that as much as I am a Russian patriot, even though I live abroad, because Russia's in my heart. No, just kidding. But you know what I'm saying? I did not, excluding the naysayers, in terms of Western propagandists, I did not think it would be such a successful move, because you just don't think of a 21st century country with a quasi-market economy being able to basically switch to this wartime economy and produce these massive numbers of tanks and shells and maintain the level while NATO countries, are running out of basic ammunition and being able to support their pet project anti-Russia, right? So to me, I guess I underestimated the ability to do that. But I think the Russian people, again, having that historic experience, even though, no one likes war, no one likes to have especially changes to a lifestyle that's become pretty comfortable for a lot of Russians compared to what it was 20, 30 years ago. I think there is that understanding that this is a necessity and this is something that's going to have to happen. And so people and Russians, I guess you can make this, I don't know, take it with a grain of salt, but if you look at Russian literature, there's a little bit of fatalism there too. So they kind of, they may not like it, but at the same time, they may accept certain things that are happening as well. But anyway, be that as it may, whatever the cause is, I feel like I was impressed that it was as successful as it actually had been, considering all the circumstances, that the relationships between countries are different, that Russia is not this industrialized powerhouse that the Soviet Union was at a certain point. Now, obviously, Russia still has industries and natural resources, but it's not quite comparable to the USSR in some ways. So I was pleasantly surprised that they were able to do that as smoothly as it seems to have happened. And like you're saying, that promotion of this must be done, you can call it state propaganda, was very mild and not really something that the way it's been presented in the West, right? If you're actually looking at the Russian media and you're looking at Russian talk shows, it was much, much, much more mild. And I think it featured an understanding of what's necessary today in the 21st century versus much more aggressive, right, world propaganda from earlier periods too. So what looked to me was that, okay, they know what's going on, of course, and they know what's coming, and they are preparing. Well, maybe nothing comes, maybe it ends, but they are preparing like they were preparing since the Crimea crisis, the 2014 crisis. So it seems like very smoothly, as you said, no state propaganda like we have to do it for the country, for the whatever. Things were just smoothly transitioning to a wartime economy. With, of course, Russia right now is sitting on a mountain of money from oil and everything. Right. And I'm not a military expert, but in my understanding, it's been happening even earlier that there's this stockpiling of shells and sort of basic military firearms, et cetera, even before this crisis, because Russia has had this experience of invasions, right? Being having had these invasions from different parts of the country historically, also being very aware of that. So I think that was actually even predated, right? The SMO, but yeah. Definitely.
I am absolutely sure that they knew what was coming from 2014, and they were just let's get ready because something big is coming. But my question was, since it talks about Leninism, it comes to my mind that the Second World War, that has nothing to do with Leninism, but one of the things that you mentioned as well was the fact that Putin, the Kremlin, the State Duma, they have put in place a subsidize families with, if I'm not mistaken, 4 or more children, or something like that.
Well, the initial program that was launched, I think in the latter part of the 2000, I think it was like 2007 or so, was the so-called maternal capital, and it was basically 2 or more children, and they could also have been adopted. It did not have to be your biological children. And there were other types of subsidies for more children, of course. Lots of sort of subsidized or free types of features that the society could offer. And so that program has been tweaked periodically with more things being added to it. It wasn't just money, it would be access to certain things, or like you're saying, subsidized perhaps education, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, Russian education is free if you qualify, if you pass certain tests, but they're also paid education. So basically, yeah, it's something that has been this program that has been sort of growing and being tweaked since the mid to late 2000s. It's been focused on the financial aspect, but of course, there's also a little bit of the sociocultural, right, promotion of the family. The church is, I wouldn't say Russians are extremely religious, but let's say obviously the Caucasus, the Northern Caucasus, with the Muslim population, they're definitely more religious than I would say the Orthodox. But people, if you were to ask people, they would still sort of generally subscribe to religious values as they pertain to the family. So there's also that sociocultural advertising, if you want to call it positive propaganda, that's there too, that I think is really important beyond saying like, here is money. Kind of like if you look at Scandinavia, that does have, let's say, good maternity leave, vacations, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, people are not really willing to have money, even though they do have that social stability. So what's missing? There's something deeper, there's something spiritual, there's something cultural, there's something social that is missing beyond that financial factor. And so I would say in Russia, yes, there's definitely been this maternal capital plus program, but there's also other things that come into play that are more about culture and society and just general values, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, looking in today's West with, let's say, some of the gender ideology that's been coming out, it's very easy to use that for negative propaganda in Russia. And I don't necessarily think it's wrong, because when you show them this versus what Russia has, it's pretty easy to choose, right? So that I think is also important. It's not just the financial aspect, but at the same time, like I said, we can go back and say the Soviet Union was more successful. Perhaps it was more traditional in terms of its sociocultural values than modern Russia, because it has been, it is sort of like a quasi-liberal capitalist society. Yeah, it's definitely, those attempts are being made, and I think Putin is definitely concerned with that aspect of, what happens after me, sort of in the grand scheme of things.
Do you think that, now this is my aluminum hat talking, do you think that this could be some premises that something big may come, and let's start repopulating Russia from the beginning, from before it?
I mean, if you put
we're having a very strong war at the moment. I call SMO, it's a war. People are dying by the tons. It's already very serious, not World War II serious at the moment, but things are escalating around the planet. And could it be, something in advance?
I mean, yeah, I guess if I were to put on my tinfoil hat, that could be one of the features, but you also have the idea, again, keeping the tinfoil hat on, that eventually some Europeans would want to flee to Russia. Now, there's a little bit of that immigration going to Russia from sort of the proverbial West, right? The US, Canada, Australia, and parts of Europe. And a lot of these people have their YouTube channels, so you can kind of see how they live. And some of them choose to go to the countryside instead of the city, which is really interesting. They really just want to live off the land and be left alone. But there is this idea that because Russia, after everything is said and done, is sort of more of a, again, spiritual, sociocultural leader compared to the decrepit, degraded West. And in some ways, I think that's an accurate qualification, now caveats included, but that some Europeans might even want to migrate in larger numbers to Russia and live in a society that's sort of more in line with their socially conservative, once again, quote unquote, normal values and ideas. So again, that's a tinfoil hat type situation, but I don't necessarily completely discount that. But at the same time, it's hard to say whether this would escalate into a larger war. Obviously, the Middle East is a very dangerous place right now, with the possibility of other countries joining that conflict. At the same time, it seems like the Ukrainian conflict is being wrapped up. I mean, that's just the mood from political statements, the official media. Things that you would not see previously are not just popping up here and there occasionally. They're sort of consistently being published across the board of what is the post-war scenario. And I'm not sure if it's a trick of like, oh, we're going to freeze the conflict and then 5 years from now we'll do something else, because I don't think that'll succeed either. But obviously there are a lot of moving parts to that conflict. So I'd hate to make a prediction because that remains to be seen. But it does seem to be sort of wrapping up, and money is being allocated to, the Middle East for obvious reasons.
Reallocated.
As opposed to, Zelensky being able to beg for money. But I'm sure he'll be fine. I'm sure he can come to Miami now that Israel is a little bit unstable, and he can. Isn't his family? Isn't that the rumor that his parents have been living in Israel as kind of like a way for him to leave Ukraine if necessary?
Well, I don't know about where they live. The rumors are that his parents were Jews, and
yes, he is Jewish, but I mean, it seemed like as kind of the rumor of like, what do you do if you're a leader of a color revolution that failed? You go somewhere else, right? And of course, that's what happened with some other Ukrainian leaders after 2014. They immigrated to either Europe or the US. And so the rumor was like, he'll either go to Israel or he'll go to Miami because it's a nice warm place, right? For
Israel is a little bit conturbated now,
If you look at, Saakashvili, right, the former Georgian leader that Georgians themselves imprisoned, which is an interesting arc for a color revolutionary leader. I mean, he ended up, after he was sort of out of power, he lived in Brooklyn, right, for a long time. Well, not a long time, but for a while. So there's definitely that parallel there. But
he was working in a U.S. university or for the government at some point, and then he went to be the governor of Odessa.
Yes, right. He was just being appointed as this imperial governor, as if it's like the British Empire sending people to the 13 colonies 300 years ago. Except now we have the other empire sending the other appointees to. Places where color revolutions were being attempted. But to go back to the question of whether Putin is a Leninist, I'm not sure if I understand if that means like, is he a revolutionary? Because if you listen to Putin's public speeches, he's definitely not a fan of Lenin in many ways, because all of his statements about Ukraine are very, very specific that it was the Leninist government, and Lenin specifically, who ended up ceding Russian historic lands to Ukraine for ideological and practical reasons. Ideologically, Lenin wanted to fight, quote unquote, great Russian chauvinism. This is what he called it, because he perceived it as imperialism akin to the British Empire. This was Lenin's ideology. On practical terms, obviously, you wanted to have more communists in sort of this other territory that would be friendly to your very new government that is still kind of unstable, and you're trying to stabilize and consolidate and make the new country, the Soviet Union, more cohesive. So there was that practical feature and then ideological feature. And then, of course, the Bolsheviks in the 20s implemented. They did this in other republics too, but they did this in Ukraine. They called it Ukrainianization, right? Ukrainizatsiya, where they sort of heightened that Ukrainian identity to the point where they implemented things that didn't even necessarily exist in certain regions before, so as to consolidate their power, which obviously ended up backfiring, as we see today. But if you listen to Putin's speeches in the last 2 years from that perspective, he's very, very, very critical of Lenin. So it's
just yesterday or the day before yesterday, he said something very, very strong in those lines.
Oh yeah,
especially about Poland.
As you said the last time you talked with us, the Russians, the more leftist Russians, criticize Putin for being too Occidental, right? Too Western,
too pro-Germanic, right. too conservative, too slow, definitely not
very
not
Leninist
enough, right? Definitely not Leninist from that perspective either. Yeah, I mean, Putin. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, conclude, please.
No, I just wanted to say that I think if you look at his, he's obviously been in power in different roles for a long time. You can kind of see a pattern. He's very predictable. First of all, he does what he says. So, even in your intro for the show, you have a clip of him saying, we've tried talking, we've tried doing this, we're not being heard. So he's been very, very clear, and then he follows through. Now, he may not follow through within a month or a year, but something will come because he's very consistent. So in that sense, he's very conservative when it comes to taking actions. He's not this, he doesn't have these knee-jerk reactions. He's kind of cold, so to speak, from that perspective. He is analytical. He evaluates the overall situation before taking any kind of action, and certain actions take years to implement. So again, if you think that he's been preparing for the war scenario since 2014, that would show you that he waited for almost a decade to actually take any kind of significant action, even though there were precursors to where he could have acted, but he didn't. Or the situation, let's say, when Turkey shot down the Russian plane, right, in that Syrian conflict in 2015, but he didn't escalate that, which could have escalated, right, to a hot conflict with Turkey. And I'm glad it didn't, because, where would we be now? But, he was also being portrayed as weak from that standpoint, because he didn't react, he didn't respond, he didn't go out with, his guns blazing. So he's very conservative, very calculated, very analytical in terms of taking actions. And really he says what he means, and then he follows through. So if Western politicians were a little bit more shrewd and they were actually paying attention rather than just completely underestimating Russia or not wanting to work with Russia or just discounting Russia, they would actually know that if you do A and B, C and D would follow. But so from that standpoint, I also would have trouble qualifying him as a Leninist. I mean, he's not a revolutionary. He definitely, he stabilized a country that was in a state of collapse, and then he really tries to create this nice balance instead of instituting some kind of radical reforms like Lenin. So again, to me, it would be maybe on a scale of is he at the scale of Lenin as a leader? Again, those are kinds of apples and oranges. I mean, regardless of what you think of Lenin, he's this global personality, historic, in a Hegelian term, he's a world historical personality, regardless of whether you think he's good or bad, right? To put it very in a very primitive way. Putin is more of a statesman. He's not an ideologue that is coming up with sort of brand new ideas that have never been implemented. So a very different qualifications. But if I had to come up with top 5 list of rulers of Russia overall, he would definitely be on the list. So that's a kind of a different situation, right? So So yeah, to give you a short answer, I would not consider Putin and Leninist in any shape or form for these reasons, basically.
Marcel.
It's well, so just to be sure, we are about almost 2 hours talking. How's your time?
I'm okay. Remember, I am a winter Latina.
Winter Latina, that's true.
I can talk like a winter Latina. Do we need to tell people what a winter Latina is, or is this a...
Yeah, that was a fantastic tweet that you I even share. I had to agree with that. Slavs women are just winter Latinas.
Some random person on Twitter /X, Elon, please don't penalize us for saying Twitter. But someone said that Slavic women were winter Latinas, and we thought it was very apt for many reasons. So yeah, I definitely can blah blah, and I can gesture, right? So as a so I definitely, my hair is curly today, so I think I sort of, I'm fulfilling that the stereotype of a winter Latina
checking
today.
all the boxes.
Yeah.
No, that's very important. I always say, and we were talking about this yesterday or the day before. I'm sleeping very little for about 3 days, so pardon me if I don't. Yeah, exactly. So pardon me if I mix the dates. But we were talking about this, and one thing that I always say is that, well, we between the Russians I know, and of course Brazilians. I'm not talking about Latins as a whole, but I'll talk about Brazilians. You can put a lot of similarities there. You actually made me think something. I'll come later. All my Russian friends, once we break these differences, we are just the same. We're just the same. We make great jokes. I have this friend of mine from CERN. Yeah, I'm not gonna say names. We were at some point competing stereotypes. He was just, and sometimes was me stereotyping Russians, and sometimes was me stereotyping
like
Brazilians.
A Westerner might get offended, right? Because it's like, how dare you? Whereas a Russian and a Brazilian would sort of lean into that and just exaggerate it. But what we're talking about, and again, it's, it could be considered stereotypical. We're talking about temperament, right? So even though Russians are, as you said, may be considered to be cold because we do not smile at every given opportunity, there has to be a reason. Other than, let's say, the service industry of service workers working with, especially foreigners, they would be doing this hello, hi, how are you, Americanized greeting, et cetera, et cetera. They would not be smiling at strangers. They would be considered strange. And we do have that saying that laughter without a cause is a sign of being foolish. So there is sort of that cultural idea. But beyond that, Russians, I would say, are more hotly tempered, much like I would take Southern Slavs, like let's say like the Serbs, for instance. I would take, and I would compare us more to Brazilians, Italians in terms of having that hot temperament. And I think the example I gave you, and it's a real example, I've had a number of conversations with either a friend or a family member in Russian where I was gesturing a lot and I was probably loud. And I was overheard by Anglo-Germanics, let's call them that. And I was asked, why are you having an argument? And I was very shocked because this was a very friendly conversation. I was just being hot-tempered in a certain way, right? Gesturing winter Latina, and there was nothing wrong. So I think like on that, in that way, Russians are probably less reserved, like once you get to know them, as opposed to that stereotype, like, oh, we never smile. So I think in that way, there are more similarities between Russians and Southern Europeans, for instance, or South Americans than between us and, let's say, again, this is very stereotypical, reserved, Scandinavians or Germans or Anglos. Now, of course, like Scandinavians and Brits, they also have a very interesting, caustic sense of humor, so we can make parallels there. That's, very different. But in terms of temperament, sort of hot and cold, again, very, very generally stereotyping. I know some people might be offended. I am not sorry, but yeah, I think there is definitely that parallel, in my opinion, where I think that, like, as funny as Winter Latina sounds, it's actually, in some ways, it's accurate. So
yeah, it works. It works pretty much.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Look, so if we're going to talk a little bit more, I think I would suggest 5 minutes intermission. What do you say? Sure, it's a good idea. So everybody agrees with that. So if pessoal que está assistindo a gente, I'm just telling the guys that we are going out for 5. Pessoal que está assistindo a gente vai 5 minutinhos para trocar a água do carburador e a gente já volta, beleza? Como é que eu faço?
Água no carburador?
Trocar a água do carburador.
Não tem água no carburador.
Okay, I'm going with this one because I don't have an intermission. I was going to do it, but I had to prepare a little bit for the talk today. Okay, intermission.
Sure. Okay.
Russia's industry is in tatters.
In short,
Russia's industry is in tatters.
In short, Russia has lost.
Putin has already lost.
This terrorist Putin.
Никто по существу не хотел разговаривать. Нас никто не слушал. Послушайте сейчас.
I simply love the Putin riding the horse with no t-shirt.
Yeah. I really like that music. I really like
It's
that
beautiful.
music.
I think we should do all the Putins. Putin diving to get that ancient Greek vase, and Putin flying with the storks or whatever it was. And then it's really like, for us, it's kind of
sharks.
like a good, the sharks, good fun, dolphins, yes. Dolphins that are probably being used for military purposes in Crimea, as the media tells us. Yeah, definitely.
They should start Putinizing something like Chuck Norris jokes.
Oh yeah.
They
oh
should
yeah.
start
It's pretty
writing
much,
those.
and I mean, my perception is it is. I mean, clearly it's propaganda, but it's like it's really fun, and it seems to me that's how he interprets it, because obviously it's very staged. But it's so funny how people sort of in more hostile environments freak out about it, and they're just like, oh, it's too masculine, it's toxic masculinity, we can't have that, and it's just that makes it even more enjoyable for me. So
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So we completely broke the subject that we are talking about. I don't quite remember.
May I try to get it back?
sure.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Well, we were talking about Ukraine, and I suggested, for coincidence, I suggested Marcelo a question based in something I heard, because Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine right now. A friend of mine told me that the hostility in between Russia and Ukraine is very old, and you can trace it until Stalin and Trotsky, because Trotsky was from Ukraine. There is any
What is nowadays Ukraine?
What is nowadays Ukraine? There is any sense on it? It was something? It was real, or just
Well, I think again, it's like people try to fit the current conflict in sort of their ideological worldview, so they sort of excessively highlight or de-emphasize, consequently, right, certain features of that. So we talked about Ukraine, right, in our previous discussion, when we talked about the regional differences in Ukraine, sort of the split between what today is Western Ukraine, which at some point was Poland, right, sort of the religiously it's different. There is a larger Greek Catholic presence. Now the Orthodox are still there. In fact, they're probably more religious because they're sort of faced with more outside hostilities historically, and a little bit of, or a lot of suppression, right? And obviously then we can talk about central Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and the east, those parts that were traditionally historic Russian lands. You know, you can look at Kiev as being the center. You know, I like to be objective and say it's sort of the, if not the birthplace, it's one of the centers of what today is Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, but obviously certain segments of Ukrainian politics and society like to just completely claim it for themselves, instead of saying that, yes, it did produce these, what today is 3 different states. I think it's a very complex question. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question about it. You say that this period of when you trace the beginning of the history of these three places, it comes back from the time when they were kind of expelling the last Mongols in the region, right? In the 50s, the 50th century, 60th century, something like this, right?
Yeah, that was basically the capital, right, of what we can call either Kievan Rus or ancient Rus. There's different terms for it, and people change it depending on their political allegiances today, whereas historians used to be a little bit more objective. The capital moved to Kiev for strategic reasons, right? Because it was closer to the trade routes, it was closer to Constantinople. So even though today Kiev is a city in a country that is called Ukraine, the other capitals would have been like the city of, Novgorod, which today is still a Russian city. So it's that whole line of thinking is easily destroyed with just this one argument. But yes, basically you had you had two features, right? You had a lot of infighting in the state of ancient Russia, ancient East Slavic state, right? Ancient Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, going into the 13th century. And then, yes, of course, you had the rise of the Mongols. So between 1237 and the early 1240s, there was this massive successful invasion going into, Russian cities like Ryazan and then going into Kiev. So of course, the conquest and the siege and the collapse of Kiev basically led to this period of stagnation, period of weak principalities of what would have been the former East Slavic state in this region. So yes, that was one of the contributing factors. And then of course, yes, there was the rise once again. Now, what today is Western Ukraine had its own thing going, because it was basically part of or on the border of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So there's that, religion plays part in terms of Catholics, right? It's a different political entity. So there is that sort of historic, geographic, cultural, religious split that was incorporated. You can make an argument whether it was just an undercurrent or it was more significant. That would depend on your perception, right? But it was incorporated into what today is a modern state of Ukraine. So I feel like if you're going to reduce the conflict in Ukraine to Trotsky or to, Khrushchev being from let's say from Donbass, where he moved, and then his wife from was from Western Ukraine, or the Soviet leader Brezhnev, who was from Ukraine, and there are other prominent Ukrainians in the Soviet government, right? So much for being oppressed. So I feel like it's a very primitive way, and it's kind of a strange selection to reduce it to that specific period as well. And, we talked about the famine in the previous episode, where it was something that affected multiple republics in the Soviet Union, not just Ukraine. And the ones who sort of try to use it for ideological purposes and who are the loudest are actually from Western Ukraine. It was not part of the Soviet Union until Stalin incorporated that territory in 1939. So it's not even applicable. So yeah, it's about people sort of trying to fit their worldview to a specific narrative, and very strategically leaving out certain types of information and amplifying other types of information.
Yeah, you pretty much see people they learn something at 16, and they study in the way to prove themselves right. They don't go after the truth. They just want to make that truth they learn from family, from whatever they learn, and they try to make it true by studying
his truth.
Yes,
they study in a way that they make it fit what they want it to fit.
They collect the facts.
You can also pinpoint very specific points in media narratives, Western media narratives. For instance, the time when the media just overhauled the way we spell Kiev with an I, and now we spell it with a Y, and how all of these thousands and millions of articles had to be overhauled, right? News articles had to be overhauled, Wikipedia, to make a certain political point. So you can also sort of pinpoint these very specific situations that are being used for propaganda purposes, and specific to, that current conflict, right? You can also go and look at the way the famine has been repositioned, reframed to make certain claims of quote unquote genocide in certain countries that again are using it for political, to basically score political points rather than an actual concern for the victims of that famine that far surpass the Ukrainian territory. So Yeah, you can, it's definitely upbringing, sort of confirmation bias. And, we could say all of us are probably guilty of that to a certain extent. And we try not to be, hopefully, if you're sort of a legitimate thinker. But yeah, they're also, if you're being bombarded with certain media narratives on a daily basis and you don't really have much interest in that subject, you're going to just absorb that as it is, especially when it's like literal verbatim lines in very different sources, right? The whole thing about, Russia's unjustified invasion that's coming from one government website and now has been disseminated in every single media article for the past almost 2 years. Yeah, so that also plays a role.
Yeah, that's one thing that I always say that I always talk to Davidson about. I mean, the average person, I mean, you have to go to work, you have to take care of your children, you have to have fun, you have to travel to. So you have so many things to do. It's very hard to just, search for deep knowledge about something. So you trust the means of communication, you trust the newspaper, you trust the television. That's what you understand.
You trust Wikipedia edited by government officials, even though it's not supposed to be.
That's the social agreement, right?
The social agreement is that,
the social contract,
exactly, is that the journalist comes to you to tell, well, they also, just like doctors, medical doctors and physicists and software developers, they play, how's it called?
The fourth estate? What are they, the fourth estate or the...
Yeah, they swear not to use their profession to do any bad.
Like a Hippocratical, like a doctor, Hippocratical,
Yeah, sure. But they seem they don't care about it very much nowadays, huh?
I'm not even sure if they care or not care. The ones who care are probably doing independent media and just struggling to survive, right? Or having a second job. And the ones that care more about professional, careerism, then they're just going to regurgitate what is given to them because they know, they're smart enough to know that should they deviate from the party line. And we've seen a few scandals, right, with journalists sort of publishing things that are a little bit too objective. They're still sort of publishing the things they're supposed to, but then there might be a couple words or phrasings, right, that are sort of deviating from what the party line is in the official West, and then they're bye-bye, your career is over. So there's definitely, I mean, as much as I'm not a fan of mainstream journalists, let's put it this way, I censored myself. I was going to be a little bit more harsh, but you can sort of understand it from,
the name of the channel. The name of the channel is the Press of Mass Destruction. So
yes, I did see that. Yeah.
You have free speech guaranteed here until we get canceled.
until we get cut off, maybe for calling X Twitter, and then it's like, no, Elon is not going to be happy with. He's not going to be happy with us. But you can sort of understand them. Again, they're journalists are also people who go to school and take care of their children. And, if they go to school for several years, they also want to make money with what they studied, right? And then they realize, oh, crap, I actually can't do what I want. And I actually have to self-censor a lot, even if I disagree with what's being portrayed. So there's also that aspect. But yeah, of course, overall, there should be more responsibility in that profession, right? That is tasked with giving accurate information. It's really interesting because I was thinking about that yesterday. I'm trying to bring my Japanese to a more, like, my reading is probably at an intermediate level, but my speaking isn't, because I've been learning it on my own. So I've been trying to take online classes, right, to bring my Japanese up to par where I feel where it's easier for me to speak, not just read and understand. And so I picked an article about the earthquake that struck China, but it was a Japanese article so that I could work on it. And it was just very interesting. Obviously, Japan is sort of in the Western sphere of influence, and any number they cited about casualties or anything about that earthquake, it was always caveated with according to Chinese media. It wasn't like this many people died in this earthquake. Like, it's probably a fact. It's not like a ideological party meeting where you have to say according to the Russian government or the Chinese media. And I was a little bit it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. You're talking about a natural disaster, like it's a natural disaster with a lot of destruction and a death toll. And you're reading all of these numbers, and each time, like literally, it was like 5. Now I know how to say really well, according to, right, someone in Japanese, because I saw, according to Chinese media, this many people died. According to Chinese media, this is how they're searching. It was literally every paragraph. It was like NHK. It was the NHK, the Japanese news source. So, I mean, you see that even, me as a language learner, I wasn't anticipating that sort of little. I think a lot of people would not even notice that propaganda feature when they're reading it. It's really more subtle when it says according to, instead of like, this is a fact, this is the casualty number.
Exactly. So, you can see exactly the things like that. When we receive information here in Brazil about the bombing in Gaza, and they say, according with Hamas Ministry of Health, 200 people died. And they go further. They say, according Hamas, 200 people died. But this fact couldn't be checked. They go further.
Which is what you had a lot with the Ukraine war as well. Anytime Kiev bombed Donetsk, it was like we could not independently verify these numbers. But anytime supposedly Russia struck, something in Ukraine, it was just this absolute horror. So it was very, very specific. And again, I think people who are media savvy, they can see the phrasing, how it can be more subtle, and that's sort of like implicit as opposed to very like Russia bad or China bad, right? But when you see that and you're not even expecting to find it in like here, right? The Japanese media talking about an earthquake, it's a natural disaster, and they're not talking about communism, right? It definitely puts things into perspective, how people are probably not, most average people, right, who are not media savvy, are not really even paying attention to that type of phrasing and how that influences your interpretation of this natural disaster. Like we probably, should we not feel sorry for the people who died in this earthquake? Is the claim that the number is smaller or the number is bigger? Like what am I supposed to, So,
exactly. It's perverse. It's just wrong.
Yeah. Now I thought since you mentioned Elon Musk, love him, hate him, it doesn't matter what he did when he labeled all media as state media. That was fantastic.
He was definitely
it was like for 5 minutes, but it was fantastic. It was a fantastic troll.
Seeing them freak out and leave Twitter, right, at the time was just really, like, the level of schadenfreude was very high. So it was really enjoyable. So yeah. For sure.
No, it was hysterical from the part of
to me, it's like
media
if you're gonna label it Russian state-affiliated media, you're gonna have to label all media state or affiliated or linked, depending on where their specific context, even if it's not directly being funded, right? Like people who understand anything about ideology and total ideology in a society, they understand that the media, even if it's technically private, right, it's connected. It's not this complete entity that exists in a vacuum that's disconnected from everything else. So it's going to be subject to ideologies, even if it's not being directly told not to publish or publish certain things, because it's operating in this total ideology realm, right? So, but of course, more often than not, they probably are being told not to publish or to publish certain things when it comes to more sensitive subjects or more sensitive conflict zones, obviously Gaza being the prime example of that. So yeah, it's, I think, labeling all media as that was hilarious. And yeah, I absolutely, I wasn't offended as a Russian whose media is labeled as, right, like, no worries, label all of them.
No, one thing that I also talked to Davidson about is that I actually prefer to know that China Daily, for example, is a state media, because at least I know that what they're talking about because the government is telling them to talk. Well, I'm not saying they don't have any level of free media there, but if they are propagating something, I know that they are propagating what the government wants.
Sure, that's a version. That's their version. Their way of seeing the facts. And it should be much more honest from the West media if they had the same approach, because I think it is just very hypocrite to say we are independent, we are we don't have sizes, we don't have a connection with anything. Our opinion is it's something that really makes me sick. Marcelo said
I just find it funny when, BBC in Britain and CBC in Canada, they claim that they're not state funded because it's taxpayer funded, but technically it's just like potato. Technically, it might be different in that very surgical sense, but in the overall grand scheme of things, it's still government funded, and it's still projecting the government point of view. And I'm still going to look at these media sources because I want to know what the official government point of view in Canada, in Britain, in China, in Russia is, but it's nice to know, right? It's nice to know these things. So yes, I think having that consistent labeling, if we're going to label anything at all, works much better than having this basically an ideological weapon, right, of selectively labeling things. And and I think it's funny, like if you go to Facebook, you still have that insane level of, it could be any Russian media, like Russian language media, that Westerners are not going to be clicking anyway. Like they probably don't speak Russian, right? Unless they're really interested. And it's always like, you're about to leave Facebook. This is a partially or wholly Russian state-controlled media source. And I'm thinking like, I actually wasn't that interested in the article, but now you pissed me off because you're putting these extra, and if I can't even access it, I'm going to Google it, or I'm going to go on Yandex, and now I'm going to read it. So the end result is the opposite to me, at least. I am now mad because you're preventing me from reading this thing that I wasn't even that interested in, but now I am, and I'm going to read it despite you jerk, right? So it's kind of funny how
you pardon me if I look like foolish.
Yeah, exactly. You're basically having the opposite, right? The opposite effect, which is, of course, what's happened with the RT bans, right? In Europe, people are basically going in their VPNs, or people are going on Rumble or whatever, other sources where they can access RT, even if they didn't care about RT. RT is sort of like, I'm glad it exists, but over the last few years, it's kind of become like, you could call it maybe Russia CNN. I think it's definitely better than Western media, but it's also not. In the early days, it had a lot more diversity of views and the types of people that they would no longer invite. Now, for better or for worse, you can make an argument in both directions. So it's just kind of funny that now that RT is banned, more people are interested in accessing it just as a screw you for preventing me, preventing my access in a normal way. I'm going to get my VPN, or I'm going to go on an alternative source, or I'm going to have someone on Twitter, right, upload a clip so I could see it directly. So it's just kind of funny how that particular type of censorship backfired.
Over here in Brazil, we had a phenomenon that was very interesting in the last two elections. We had the one of the candidates, the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, that he get a lot of attention because the formal media, the mainstream media didn't like him. They didn't like him. They attacked him all the time. They were always saying he was fascist and all this stuff. And the people were so
all the
sick.
bullshit bingo.
Yeah, and the people were so sick of the media. They were so aware that the Brazilian media is for sale, that if they don't like him, he's probably good. And they vote him in mass. They took a mostly no one. He was a no one in 2016.
Well, that was kind of like the Trump, right? The Trump phenomenon. Obviously, different circumstances, but if you think about how much hate was being poured sort of across the board in a very consistent sort of way, it was almost like a screw you. If you're saying this person is bad.
in Bolsonaro case, I think it was even bigger because Bolsonaro was not a billionaire.
Right,
He
right.
didn't have his own money, you know.
Yeah, but he was funded by a billionaire.
Yeah, of course. He had a lot of support, of course. But
From Trump.
From Trump, from that group of power, of course. But the personality, the guy itself, was not. He didn't star a famous TV show like Trump did.
Right.
People didn't know him. People didn't know him at all. They put him in
It's
internet.
almost like this Streisand effect, right? Don't look at this person. Don't go check this person. Like the opposite of what you want
Yes,
to
and
happen.
they did it in mass. They did it in mass because the media didn't like him. If these guys don't like him, and then you have this problem in Brazil. Brazil is a binary thinking people. If you are not good, then you are evil. If you are not evil, then you are good. They don't understand that evil don't like evil too. So they follow
Sometimes
that logic.
Good don't like good too.
Good don't like good, exactly. And they just concluded that if those bad guys don't like this guy, then he is good. That happened in Brazil on that time. Right, so because they are those so,
which is interesting because that's like to me that's basic human psychology to go for the forbidden fruit. So it's kind of funny that they're still trying to do this stuff instead of like if you look at Russia despite all the Western propaganda of this mass censorship, it gives you access to Western media. It invites, let's say, hostile experts on the talk shows. Now, obviously, it serves a purpose to show the sort of what should be perceived, right, as negative, but the access is there. I mentioned to you before how I can go on these translated websites of all major, American, German, whatever, Japanese newspapers, and some of them are under paywall in the original, but I can read them in the Russian and actually read them for free. And there's no censorship. You get the full spectrum of what everyone else is saying, and I find that very helpful. So it's really interesting how the Kremlin would rather give you access. I mean, obviously, this comes with caveats. There are certain things that have become a little more difficult with, the special military operation. But overall, like in terms of access to foreign media and hostile media, I almost feel like it's better in Russia than in, let's say, some parts of Europe, for instance, where Russian media is banned, media from Iran is banned, et cetera, et cetera. So.
No, we just had last week or a couple of weeks, a Brazilian guy that's living in China, and he basically started this kind of work that we are doing here during the COVID times. Oh, I cannot say this word. During the pandemic times, whatever, whatever YouTube enjoys. Because
it's true. It's funny. You can't say. You have to spell certain words out or use
ACIs and stuff like that. That's just stupid. And this guy started his channel. He's more on the Instagram side, but he started doing this because he was inside a shop, and on TV it was showing some or he was looking in the internet, and
he
it was showing
the internet,
and this media group, this Western media group, I think it was CNN, CNN Asia, was simply showing that the
horrors of China,
the horrors of the Kuf with all the people with hazmat suits and stuff like that in his city.
Right, and he's like, wait a second,
where he was inside a supermarket,
right,
doing shopping, and he just pick up his phone and start streaming, say, hey, this is what they're saying. I'm here. Look around. Let's go outside. And he started doing this, and we talked to him about this situation with the media, and he said, look. We were talking about the freedom in China, and he was saying, look, you will have Facebook is banned here in China, all Meta, I mean, Instagram was okay until they become Meta, and when they become Meta, it was banned because Meta is banned because
But it's
China.
like it's the company that's banned. It's not the people who are going to access it. They're going to be penalized, right?
Exactly.
So it's like.
And I was in Egypt. I say that too many times in the channel, but I was in Egypt in the beginning of this year, and I say this not to brag that I was in Egypt, but to very interesting perspectives. Meta is banned in Egypt. It's not banned, but for example, WhatsApp, you cannot make a phone call.
Okay.
You can text, but you cannot make a phone call. You cannot make a video or phone call with Instagram. You can post photos, but no phone call or even Facebook. You cannot do anything with these guys. You cannot do it with Telegram as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the only one that was available was Viber, if I'm not mistaken. It was the only one. And I mean, if I was in Brazil during the time of this Arab Spring times, and the first thing I noticed, and we were having also a very strange time. At some point in the channel, we're going to start talking about the 2010s because it was a very interesting times.
Yes, not just Arab Spring. I mean, there was an attempt at regime change in Russia, right, in 2011, 2012.
We had a regime change in Brazil, actually.
Right.
We had
and
it.
all over South America, actually. The Kirchner government, Dilma Rousseff government. I mean, in Paraguay there was regime change sometime before, and then you had Colombia, Bolivia, all those guys. Yeah, it was a world campaign.
Yeah.
It was the beginning of the end, as I call it.
Unipolar model, yes.
Yeah. No, it's and I was talking about Egypt because Egypt has these policies because of what Facebook and I was talking about Brazil because I was watching on TV the reporters saying that it all looks very emerging from the people. The people organize themselves on Facebook. What nobody says is that things like NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and all this NGOs.
Millions and millions.
Well, they certainly published a lot of articles about it, bragging, right? That it's not like it was like this secret. So it's kind of funny that on the one hand you were getting this presentation of a grassroots, right? All of a sudden, super well organized movement that came seemingly out of nowhere. But at the same time, there were subsequent articles that were bragging, right, about the use of social media, the relationship between NGOs. So you can kind of put those things together, right, without perhaps maybe not always explicit. It wasn't explicitly stated, but you could definitely put those two together. So yeah.
Yeah, and he was saying that in China, well, I mean, all these things are blocked, but every Chinese knows how to use a VPN, so it's not a big deal. It's just
and again, it's like the things that are
not.
blocked. It's not like people are going to prison for using it. It's like the company is blocked for violating certain rules. So if you look at Meta, right, that was not banned in Russia until they started allowing Azov and other types of extremist military formations to post absolutely outrageous, violent content. And had that content been published in North America about, people who live there, I think there might have been some very serious involvement from the local intelligence agencies. And so what Russia did basically was, I think it told Meta to either remove the content or it was going to be penalized. And obviously they decided that they're not going to remove it. And so Meta got penalized. So to me, it's like, it's not that an average Russian can't go on Facebook. I mean, I still have, Facebook obviously is like an awful social media with an awful algorithm, but you still kind of have that tradition, right, of occasionally checking in. And, I still have Russians on there that are using whatever they're using. So it's not like they're being penalized. It's like the company is the one that violated local laws. So I don't really see how that's a huge deal. But beyond that, yes, of course, people have VPNs and other means to access information too. So
Yeah, but it's always portrayed like all this terrible dictatorship somewhere and doing these terrible things with freedom, and nobody
At the same
says that
time,
this
none of
guy's...
us in the Free West could post any alternative information about that certain illness, right, that you mentioned that went around a few years ago. So that was instantly removed. So speaking of what we could and could not post, right? So
it is very curious to see how over here in Brazil, the mainstream media struggles in this matter, because they really want to take away the concurrence, the options for the information. So they don't like the social media and the internet on this way. But at the same time, when the government goes in the direction to control it, to make laws, to protect the national environment from foreign influence and all stuff, they attack it like authoritarian
right.
movement. You know, it is impressive.
Only when it challenges their power, right? Is when they're concerned.
Exactly.
So, which is not surprising. Yeah.
Yeah. So we still have some things about how are you guys feeling? I'm doing okay here, but I have to know about your time.
Longer. We can go a little bit longer.
Nina, you're the best. You're the best. It was going to be about 3 hours. Jesus Christ. It's going to be our long show so far.
Indeed.
And well, trying to come back a little bit about this Trotsky and Stalin stuff that we completely crossed at some point here, and it's all right. I mean, the chat was fantastic. It's been fantastic. We were talking about this situation when Trotsky left the Soviet Union, and then he exiles in Cuba. And then after that, he goes to Mexico, and then he's assassinated.
Yes, he got ice-picked. So today we get to make memes about it. And obviously, it's not a very pleasant, it's a violent death. But yes, today we get to, since we're so historically removed from that period, we get to make memes about it. So
talking about memes, not once I used this today.
Perfect. Good timing. Good timing.
So
yeah, but, I mean, it's really not surprising that, you know, again, Stalin was a very shrewd leader, but obviously he also was a ruthless leader. So he was eliminating an enemy abroad. And, you know, the 1930s obviously was a period when Stalin and his allies within the party, sort of the right of the party, air quotes, he also eliminated, right, some of the sort of what perceived enemies, real or perceived, within the party too. So that's sort of what's known as the Great Purge. Obviously, we're not endorsing, right, executions of people, especially for political reasons, but the takeaway here is something that I brought up earlier in our previous discussion, is that it makes more sense to look at Russia from 1917 until World War II as one long revolutionary period, because there was so much social restructuring, there was so much instability, there was the fear of external enemies, which eventually came to pass, right, with World War II. And when you have a revolution, in most cases, revolutions are violent. And so I think Trotsky himself made, and obviously this was sort of earlier on, he made a parallel between the French Revolution, right, and then the sort of Thermidor and sort of the blowback after 1789. So some people like to make that parallel about the Russian Revolution and then sort of the consolidation of power sort of as the blowback too. But, you know, I think the only way you can look at the Russian Revolution, maybe the Chinese Revolution, as a separate event, maybe is because of the scale, because these countries were large and they had large populations. But generally, I don't think they're that different from other revolutions where there is this violent struggle for power. And unfortunately, in a violent struggle for power, even after a civil war, some normal, ordinary people may suffer. This is what happens. But going back to the opening of the archives, I think one of the most important things that came out that unfortunately is still permeating the so-called conservative mind, right, the anti-communist mind, is that it wasn't like gazillion, billion people that were executed for political reasons, but the number was, well, it still kind of ranges, right? It depends on how you estimate it. Some people say it was like 600,000. Some people say it was closer to 2 million, but it's definitely not 10, 20, 30, 50 million. Now, obviously, that is still a large number. Some people were still being, persecuted for, let's say, being religious leaders, because the Soviet Union was officially an atheist society, at least for a while, until Stalin allowed religion in the context of World War II. But that was a really important point that on the one hand, yes, it's terrible that some people suffered. On the other hand, the number was it wasn't like anywhere near from close to the Cold War estimates from sort of famous Cold War historians like, Robert Conquest is still being cited many, many, many decades later. And, there are all those nasty little publications like the Black Book of Communism. And I feel like if you're going to criticize something, you should criticize it factually based on actual accessible historical data. And then it's going to be a legitimate criticism rather than exaggerating something 10, 20, 30-fold, right? And then it's just basically propaganda. And, in my family, I've lost some ancestors in that situation. I mentioned one, right? My great
was a priest, right?
Yeah, he was a priest, but also some other family members who never came back. I can only assume they died, perhaps in a camp. But the other problem here is that it wasn't just political prisoners that were being put into these camps in the 1930s. It was also regular prisoners who committed crimes. They were all sort of mixed in. So some Western historians like to make the argument that the Soviet system was too harsh in punishment for theft and perhaps other types of crimes going, all the way to murder. So non-political crimes was too harsh. And then it's, it could be a little bit problematic, right? If you look at, let's say, the American judicial system, the punishments can go all the way to the death penalty, whereas in Canada and in the UK, some people would say it's too light. Someone who committed premeditated murder may get like 10 years or 15 years in prison, which is really outrageous, and then be out. So there's, you can have that debate about the judicial system and benefits and drawbacks and the types of punishment even today. So if you look at the numbers of people who were actually in the camps, they were not all political prisoners. They were being punished for, some people, not all obviously, were being punished for actual crimes like theft and, murder and burglary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit more of a complicated question. But yeah, certainly there was that political persecution aspect, and Stalin was, a ruthless leader, and he did go after his enemies within the party, whether they're actual enemies or perceived enemies. So yes, it's, something that happened. It's sort of a darker part of that period. But to me, like I said, it's sort of like I view it as this is part of the revolution. Unfortunately, in a lot of revolutions, you do have that violent feature that until society is sort of consolidated and cohesive and sort of in line with this new ideology, new regime, new government, whatever, those things may happen. So it's unusual for a revolution to be non-violent.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Why Mexico? It was him cooking something there? There was a plan going on, or he just want to?
He just hanging out with Frida Kahlo. He just really liked Mexican painters. Yeah, I mean, I think
he was probably planning to take an intifada.
Oh, something like this.
Every time I hear this word, I think about Mexican food. Like one burrito, 2 intifadas, please. Please. And I'm going to be
I think when someone is banished from political power, they still have aspirations. Again, we don't have to think about Trotsky, right, himself. We can look at current political leaders or even going back to, the former Georgian color revolution president Saakashvili, he obviously wanted to be back in power when he was initially banished, right? Which is why he was appointed or was able to perform that role in Ukraine. So I think there's also a little bit of a personality factor there too for Trotsky or any of the other banished politicians. But obviously he was a convinced ideologue, right, in terms of what he perceived to be accurate representation of Marxism, having more of a global revolution, right, being focused on the Comintern and so on and so forth. So it's not surprising that Stalin still perceived him as a threat, right? It's not like he just went on vacation and he was just hanging out at the beach and hanging out with famous Mexican painters, right? So clearly Stalin did have that concern of a foreign influence by using someone that had a prominent role in Russian post-revolutionary society. He was also, again, he had that prominent role in the Red Army, which he, he essentially founded it. So he was kind of like this hero of revolution. You look at him, he looks like this nerd, but he wasn't just this kind of nerdy looking guy with glasses, right? Because he had that prominent role in the Red Army. So yeah, I think Stalin was concerned about having that foreign influence on someone that was his enemy, his ideological enemy as well. So, I mean, it's not surprising that he was assassinated that many years later.
But he's staying in Mexico. Just one more, Marcel, please.
Go.
Staying in Mexico, it's something that me and Marcel were talking about earlier. Because I see on this way, he went a prominent member of the Communist Party Union, the guy that founded the Red Army in the United States border, influencing the Mexicans.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the other interesting part is that I'm not a specialist on Central American history or Mexican history, but I do know that at this time, right, I do know a lot more about American foreign policy. So obviously the US had a pretty strong and heavy-handed interventionist policy in Latin America, right, with actual physical military interventions. And in fact, it perceived it to be the right, justified thing to do. Started with the Monroe Doctrine, right, in the 19th century, and then it was sort of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in, I think it was like 1904, where military intervention basically was allowed for Americans. So they went into like Nicaragua multiple times. Cuba was kind of like, was able to be nominally independent, but not really. So there's all that history. And of course, you had these massive conglomerates, which is where like the term banana republic comes from, right? Because like the United Fruit Company controlled large parts of, I believe was like Guatemala. They were able to influence elections. They owned land. So it was not just like a corporation that extracted a natural resource. It was something that really dominated the political landscape of multiple countries in Central and South America. But when FDR, right, Franklin Roosevelt came into power in the early 1930s in America, in his mind, and again, that's in line with American ideology, people outside of that would say he really kind of did imperialism by another name, but he tried to mend relations within Latin America. So for instance, he canceled the Platt Amendment, right? That would have allowed some of this excessive American interventionism in Latin America. He tried to mend relations with Mexico because obviously it's right on the border of the United States. His government established, I can't remember the name of that organization right now, but it was basically kind of like an NGO, so to speak. Well, it was a government organization, but it had sort of that socio-cultural function of promoting friendship, right, between the US and different countries in the region. So basically, from the American perspective, he was trying to improve relations in the region and portray the US as sort of not as this heavy-handed imperialism, but more of a partner. Now, of course, that's obviously we can criticize that in a very obvious way because it's, in my opinion, it was imperialism by just another name. But I think that's an interesting context, right, to the 1930s up until World War II with, if you want to look at Trotsky, in Mexico, and if you want to go down, you want to put on your tinfoil hat and go down that rabbit hole, you can probably do that to a certain extent. So.
Yeah, the what we were talking about it was exactly about this. I mean, it's portrayed also as evil Stalin sent assassination to assassinate Trotsky, but it's interesting that he could have done it inside the USSR. Then Trotsky left the USSR and went to Cuba. And I mean, the USSR had a hand on Cuba, so he could just do it like that as well. And then he goes to Mexico.
It was later.
And then he goes to Mexico. No, but in any case, there was some hand on.
Well, the USSR didn't really have a hand on Cuba till.
Yeah, it was later.
Till 59, right? So prior to that, it was more like American businesses were essentially running Cuba. Yeah, so Cuba was kind of it was out of the question at the time.
Okay, so I use my ignorance card, but in any case, what it sounds interesting is that what we were more or less talking about is that what if, and I'll just throw this question here because ignorance card. What if all this fight between Stalin and Trotsky was more something like, okay, look, we want to do socialism for the country. Mm-hmm. You want to do international socialism, you do you, I do me, you go and you do whatever you want. And then go into these parts. And I'm just throwing this thought. And mm-hmm. I mean, it's not for an answer. It's just for maybe a reflection. If you have something, I mean, does it at least make sense?
If you wanted to say, nah, it's just crazy, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I don't care.
Well, I mean, I am known to put on the tinfoil hat occasionally, so I don't really rule everything out. But I would say I'm undecided on what you're trying to insinuate here. Because, I mean, again, Stalin did tackle his perceived enemies in the party in the Soviet Union. He did have multiple highly positioned members of the party executed. So it would be in line mm-hmm. with something that he would do, go after a prominent opponent, right? Even if it is abroad. But, obviously, perhaps I should go down the conspiracy theory websites and see what some of the other common theories are about that. So.
Yeah, I don't know if you see that meme, if you saw that meme that by the rate of things that happening, United States will run out of conspiracy theories in about 3 years or something like that.
No, but I can see why that's a popular meme. Yes, exactly. It takes about, I think the other meme was like, it takes about 6 months to go from conspiracy theory to like the real news and reality. So, yeah.
Clayton Morris from The Redacted, he says that conspiracy theory is just a spoiler alert. Exactly.
Yeah. No, I mean, not to be very pedantic, I mean, there are certain conspiracy theories. I almost feel like they're being introduced artificially to delegitimize legitimate conspiracy theories. So it would be like, like the flat earth stuff or any of these really kind of out there theories that then are being lumped together with things that sound more legitimate to say, haha, look how crazy all these people are. They believe this and that. And so I almost feel like it's done artificially, like introducing some of these more outrageous concepts that sound crazy to most of the population. It's done to delegitimize more reasonable types of questioning that are outside of the mainstream. So.
Yeah. So Nina, Davidson has to go.
Oh yeah.
If you want, we can finish here. If you want to blah blah a little bit more, I'm up for it.
Go ahead.
You decide.
Why don't we do like 10, 15 more minutes? We can talk, and then we could sort of wrap up your longest episode so far.
Oh yeah. Dave, so you want to say something before go, just to
Well, just thanks very much. I really appreciate it. It is very important to us. Your last talk with us was just great. Marcelo was breaking it in shorter for weeks, and they were all great. Yeah. That was very good. And this
I had to send you.
Oh yeah, this talking today was just as great as the last one. Thank you very much. Thank you for trusting on us. And
well, I think this is an interesting sort of, again, multipolar, right? It's a little bit of a cliche, but you know, I'm a Russian in North America. You're in Brazil. You're a Brazilian, right, in Europe. So it truly is kind of a multi-vector, multi-perspective discussion that we're having here that probably surpasses certain other discussions with people more within sort of the same social context. So
that's it. That's precisely it. Well, thank you very much. I will support my wife. My wife has a small business, and she has some clients.
She's the Soviet type of feminist, right?
Women, yes,
she's
for
working,
sure.
And at the same time, she's active in the family. So there you go.
Yes, that's precisely it. And I will deliver. She produces, I deliver. So I need to go there and deliver her stuff, you know.
She's the boss.
In this one, yes, we changed the boss position in some different subjects.
That's how it should be. Strengths and weaknesses working together. So
precisely,
that's called cooperation.
Yeah,
that's cooperation. That's it. That's precisely it. Nail it.
Well, it's good to see you. We're gonna blob on for a few more minutes, and then we can probably wrap up the longest episode, if you don't mind.
Sure that. Okay, I'm going now. Thank you very much, and good evening for everyone. Boa noite, gente. Obrigado pela presença aí. Eu vou nessa. Tchau, tchau.
See you. Okay.
By the end of this, I'm going to learn some Portuguese, probably.
Please do. I love languages. I myself personally love languages. I speak, apart from Portuguese and English, that English is, when I learned, now I'm a bit rusty, but when I learned, I was super fluent on it. And then I learned French, living in France and then Geneva. Right. And now I also speak semi-fluent Italian. I
think because they're all, for you, right? They're Romance languages. So it was probably easier for you to learn Romance languages as opposed to like German, right? That is obviously a different language. So I feel like with me knowing some French, so I can read it and understand a lot, but I don't use it for speaking. So I can't go to France and randomly speak and ask for my croissant. Sorry for French stereotypes. It's delicious. But you know what I'm saying? So, and also I've done some Latin. So whenever I sometimes see Spanish, I know zero Spanish, but I can understand it just based on that Romance language root, right? So obviously it doesn't always work because words can change meanings. And I know that from, let's say, the similarities between Russian and Polish, sometimes it's like the same word and it has a very different meaning. So there are sort of limits to that. But yeah, I feel like Romance languages are probably nice to learn together. So.
Yeah, interestingly that you mentioned this Polish and Russian stuff. When I was in Poland, I stood a week in Warsaw. It's very and also in the what's it called? It's just in front of me here, Croatia. They use the Western alphabet, the Latin alphabet, but it's funny because the words are horribly written. Because we don't have those.
Meant. I think didn't we talk about this? That Cyrillic is meant for the sounds, like the sh,
exactly.
like all those sounds that exist in different Slavic languages. Cyrillic was invented for that purpose. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how with Catholicization and Westernization, some of these languages switched. And obviously, Ukraine sometimes talks about using the Latin alphabet, but it's actually not meant for that language. So it's like, this is this really dumb political statement because you're making your life more difficult by using something that's not meant for it. But yeah, it's kind of funny to me because obviously the relationship between Poland and Russia today leaves much to be desired. So on that level, obviously, it's Poland is sort of like the attack dog for NATO. But on my personal level, as an immigrant, as a Russian diaspora in Canada, the US, I consistently have had good relationship. Like some of my best friends have been Polish, and it wasn't like me deliberately seeking out, right, Poles. So it's kind of funny if I look at my friendships over the long term, it's really strange. It wasn't like other Russians, it was the Poles, maybe a couple of Serbs, and the Chinese. So those would be like, the Poles and the Chinese are sort of my consistent multipolar friends in immigration over the long time. So it's kind of interesting how on a personal level you can find common ground with people who are from a similar culture to you, similar linguistically, even if you had disagreements politically. And some of them are fans of the Soviet Union and some of them are not, but we never have sort of these disagreements where we have where we don't speak for months or something like that. There is this understanding, which is so interesting, that it seems to be like it hasn't worked at the political level, right, at the highest levels of power. But as soon as I am interacting as an average person with average Poles in North America, we're always able to find some kind of common ground with just very basic things, sense of humor, food, et cetera, language. So yeah, it's funny how that works, because people are always surprised when I tell them that, oh, you haven't been friends with other Russians consistently, like you haven't been friends with other Slavic ethnicity that's friendly. It's like, it hasn't really been Serbs. Like, well, yeah, a couple of Serbs, it's mostly been Poles. Isn't that funny? So yeah, it's kind of a funny comment.
It's interesting. I mean, just when you were talking about it, I was thinking for a second, and it's like probably when you are abroad and you are diaspora, as you mentioned in the other video, you're not there anymore, but you're not at the United States.
Yeah, you're sort of like in between.
Exactly, you're in between things, and well, that's common ground for everybody that's in the same situation. So that kind of forced people to break apart.
Yeah,
from
I used
the,
to kind
from the
of
basic.
when I was much younger. So I was kind of more. I can kind of see how people make political mistakes. So I was more like conservative in the Western term, sense of American, Canadian conservative, and so I used to be kind of offended by thinking that I have all this stuff in common with other immigrants, but now I definitely embrace it because it's just so obvious. Not just the practical ways of adjusting to a new country, but it could be someone from Southeast Asia and just hospitality, like all these other things that we can find in common. I know it sounds very sort of like kumbaya cliche right now, but I started to sort of see these things that there probably is a reason why I have made friends from, let's say, consistently. I have had friends in China without searching them out, including in places where there are not a lot of Chinese immigrants living. There's just certain things that we find in common as our respective diasporas, like you're saying, even if there's a broad difference between our cultures in many quantifiable ways.
Yeah, and in my family, for example, I was raised in a way that I will not say it was perfect, but I was raised in a way that we were not exacerbating the differences. So it was a very neutral environment, so everybody was okay. It doesn't matter the skin color, it didn't matter the sexuality, whatever, being man or woman, or a foreigner. And so this, from me, it's not. For me, it was the normal, but I see today that it's not so trivial as
sure. And
as
it's
a
really
race.
interesting to me, as sort of coming out of like the late Soviet, early post-Soviet Russia, where there was definitely this, concept of equality of the people and different cultures. And it's not to say that it was practiced perfectly at the lowest levels. So for instance, I'm part Georgian, I have dark hair, I have dark eyes. So when I was very little, I did have these blonde little girls trying to make fun of what I looked like. But they didn't really know how to properly make fun of me. So there's like, when you grow up, you're going to wear black lipstick. And they weren't wrong, because I did have a goth phase in high school, and then a metal phase, which I guess is not black lipstick. But yeah, so it was definitely not perfect. It's not like it was completely a society free of xenophobia, but I would say it was a lot more free than certain other Western societies that claim to be so in today's day and age. So it was definitely interesting for me to come to North America and then have certain ideas imposed to me, because I'm a Slav, but I am white, and therefore I'm supposed to think in a certain way and be perceived in a certain way. So the way that I would be perceiving myself and the way that I was raised would be very different from certain ideas that were being imposed to me socially. So that was definitely a wake-up call too.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, because when I came here, so for me, this mixing, well, to start, Brazil, it's a very mixed country. So most Brazilians are already used, not saying that there is no such things as bad things, but they are used to live among different people with many differences. So when I came here, when I got out of Brazil and came to Europe, well, I don't have problem to mix with Europeans. Well, first of all, when it comes to immigration, I think, well, I'm in their home. Okay, so I cannot come here and just pretend
demand my own
things. And I mean the basic things. Nobody's going to piss you off if you're eating rice and beans different from here. Nobody's going to piss you off about your religion in general if you do not push your religion into them, of course. In general, nobody's going to piss you off. And the funny thing was that I was not enjoying meeting Brazilians here. I have Brazilian friends here, but they were Brazilians that came from Brazil. We were friends before we moved, before meeting here again, and they were also they had similarities with the same way, and they themselves don't like to meet Brazilians, because the first thing that was happening when you meet, and we have met in the street, oh, you're Brazilian, because people listen to you, oh, you're from Brazil, that's pretty cool. And most of the time, the first thing that the person, not even 10 seconds, they don't even present themselves. They start bad-mouthing the Italians or the French or oh, these Europeans, they are cold, as you say. They are cold. Yeah, we Brazilians, we smile too much. That's true. But myself, I not that much, but it's true. We smile too much, as you said. We smile to the point that we look stupid. Just.
Well, my experience is the Russian diasporas. Well, first of all, it's when they say Russian, it really is people from the former Soviet Union. They're not necessarily ethnically Russian, right? It could be from any of the former republics, and it could be from different periods. It could be from people who were considered, well, they considered themselves Soviet refugees, right? So they have very particular ideological opinions about the Soviet Union that would be very different from my beliefs. And then you have families that have immigrated right after the revolution. So they may or may not even speak Russian. They still consider themselves Russian. And so there's that diversity. And I think that applies to a lot of other places too, that it's waves of immigration. It's not just sort of this one. I mean, there may be sort of a large wave with people from the same sociocultural circumstances, but usually it's more diverse than that. But my impression was that on the one hand, I would occasionally be excited to see people, especially if you live in a place where there are not a lot of people who speak your language, and your only contact is basically your like family, friends on the phone, on whatever messengers, or watching the news or YouTube or whatever. So from that standpoint, you might get excited that it's someone who shares your language or culture, but there is that whole concept, right, of weaponized immigrants, and some people trying to going overboard to fit into this new society by excessively bashing not the new society, but by bashing their culture. And it's just very, very off-putting, where it's just done to such an extent that you don't even have like the worst Western propagandas going that far. So when you see people bashing their own, to that extent, not the government, but everything. You know what I'm saying? It's okay to criticize the government. I may disagree with you, but when they're just criticizing the most trivial things that shouldn't even be a subject of such venom, it's really off-putting, and that really turns you off of participating in that diaspora community, right? So there is that. Now, of course, there are other people who are completely normal. They're either apolitical and you can associate with them, right? Or they may share your politics to a certain extent. But to me, I guess initially in the first while, I've met a lot of even when I wasn't really all that politically conscious, but especially as I was becoming more politically conscious about my own background, et cetera, I was really just turned off by these so-called weaponized immigrants, as I like to call them, because like you're still not going to fully fit in, even if you speak the language perfectly. People may see your last name and say, oh yeah, you have zero accent in Canada or the US, but you have this last name or you eat this food. You're not gonna fit in completely. And so why are you going overboard? Like there's something within you, some kind of insecurity, something that is lacking, that you feel the need not just to criticize the government. Like I said, that's fine, even if I disagree with you, but you're criticizing the most minute features of your own culture. Like it's very, very self-hating. So I was really just turned off of the Russian emigre community from that perspective. But since then, I have met people, a lot of them are online, right, that sort of share, again, they might not be very political, but they're sort of just normal people that can discuss apolitical subjects with you, and it's fine. So it's kind of, it's gotten a little bit better, but definitely that initial impression was not good. And I've seen similar things with other diasporas where the country in question is being portrayed as a geopolitical opponent. So for instance, you know, a couple of my Chinese friends here, they either just don't want to discuss politics at all, not that you should, but they're almost like afraid to share their opinions of China if it's something positive, or they go into this very typical diatribe of I love China, I hate the CCCP. And it's just, I don't even know if that's their actual opinion or if that's what they're used to saying to the public, especially in, you know, in the US and now in Canada too, with Canada and China becoming a little bit more hostile towards each other in the last few years. So yeah, so I see that it's not just Russian diasporas that have this weaponized immigrant problem, but it's definitely to me really just revolting, basically. I just nothing good to say about that. It just comes across as trying too hard and going way beyond your, let's say, disagreement with the government, which is, yes, that's fine, that's your right. You can have a disagreement with the government, you can criticize it on a legitimate basis, but when you're criticizing and you're just painting everything with this dark brush.
We actually made a video in our channel. It's in Portuguese. I'm sorry. It may have subtitles. Okay. I think it was a live video, just me and Dave, some chit-chatting about stuff. And one of the points was that people don't know how to complain. To what complain about how, I mean, I don't expect that you, for example, you're a historian, I don't expect that you come with a solution for the metro of the city, but to the subway or something like that. But when someone complains, oh, we don't have subway, or, well, look around, is not having the subway the problem, or there is solutions that are not working as well as they should.
And does that mean that your people are bad and morally bankrupt? No, it does not. It means that it's a problem that has a solution. So when you say, for instance, one constant meme about Russia, it's probably died down because people have seen that Russia does have good infrastructure, not everywhere, but it's been improved, about bad roads in Russia. And that just always rubbed me the wrong way because I've always lived in the north of North America where the temperature fluctuations are significant. So there's always cracks in the road. So I literally, at one point, I was in different cities in Canada, the US. I went around and I took pictures to show you what a typical road looks like in different places. So 2 different countries to show some of these people, even in Russia when they're complaining about this, so this is what our roads look like. They have potholes, they have cracks, they haven't been repaired. Some of them haven't been repaired for years. This problem exists everywhere. It's not just Russia. And people were just kind of shocked. So I feel like in some ways they also do exist in this bubble of stereotypes, especially if they haven't traveled to other places, or they travel as tourists, they haven't lived in other places, so they have a very idealized perception of the, people usually travel to places that they like, so that sort of reinforces their idealized perceptions. Like if I go to Japan, I'm like, Japan is wonderful, but I don't think I want to live in Japan for many reasons, even though I think it's wonderful. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting how that gets conflated with the fact that the Russian people are barbaric, uncivilized, decrepit, et cetera, like you're saying, like sewage in Brazil. Like it's a problem, it's an infrastructure problem. It can have a solution. If China can go from having a very few fast trains to completely rehauling that industry in a decade and surpassing many other countries, that means that it is possible. Does that mean that the Chinese suddenly became better people? Or does that mean they actually had the structure and the money and the government able to implement these changes? It's probably the latter, right? So yeah, when there is that sort of parallel between the moral qualities of a people as being uncivilized, barbaric, et cetera, it's just really, really off-putting, especially when they're talking about themselves in that, their own culture. Like, I'm different, but all the other people from my country are shit, pardon my French, right? So it's just really, really off-putting. So,
well, actually in French is merde. But
in Canadian French, it would be more like Catholic. It would be sacre bleu, or like one of those religious. Sacre bleu, yes. Tabarnak. Tabarnak. Yeah, it's all very Catholic. French Canadian swearing is very Catholic and very mild. It's kind of cute.
No, Italian it's funnier. It's very blasphemic. It's funny, so blasphemic.
It's still Catholic, but it's blasphemous. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Interesting.
But very strong blasphemy. It's super cool. But yeah, no, that's a point. When I was talking about, I found, just to be clear also for people that is watching this, I'm not bad-mouthing Brazilians. I mean, I'm Brazilian. And even inside Brazil, you're gonna see different cultures inside Brazil. And not always they are good, going along very well, perfectly. So it's not about, I don't like to meet Brazilians here because other people are better or worse or whatever. It's just that it's annoying that every time, these people here is this, the people here is that. Well, come on, go back home, man. What are you doing here? I mean, I made...
Exactly. If I meet other Russians here, I'm not going to just engage in random Canada-US bashing. I may talk about politics, right, foreign policy, but I'm not going to talk about certain kind of day-to-day things, because there are many good things, obviously, about both the US and Canada. So it's almost like it just kind of sets a really negative precedent of not being too grateful about the things that you have, right? You can be legitimately critical, but I think I know what you mean. I've seen that too, not to the same extent probably.
Yeah, sometimes I just feel like, people complaining too much about the things around. I just feel like, maybe you're just an asshole.
Right.
And that's why I don't want to be next to you right now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
No, I agree. I think diasporas are problematic. I think there's also this question of why do people immigrate, right? So people, the perception is that people immigrate to have a better life, but you can also say that some people are more adventurous, and the negative counterpart of adventurous would be very opportunistic. So if they're easily just leaving, let's say without maybe legitimate reasons to leave, there are certain personality features, right, that are required for people to just take off and immigrate. Again, this is very broad. It doesn't pertain to other people. A lot of people immigrate for socioeconomic reasons, like obviously. But I feel like there might be more people with almost like sociopathic traits that are part of that immigration flow. And so let's say when Europeans complain about refugees, they're sort of painting all the refugees with this broad brush, when really that refugee flow has mostly, normal people who just want to be out of the war zone, likely started or was aided and abetted by, NATO countries, by the way. But also there are going to be these people who are opportunistic and perhaps have antisocial traits, sociopathic traits. And so then they see, oh, look, this person from such and such non-European country committed such and such crimes. That means all people from, such and such country are going to do this. But it's just really an unfair comparison, because I feel like personality disordered individuals are going to be part of this refugee flow, are going to be part of even legal immigration, right? So that becomes problematic on a different level.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if you heard about the situation in what's it called, Ireland, where there was an attack from, I think, someone from Morocco or something like that, and
I saw the blurb. I don't know the details, so I don't feel equipped commenting on it. But I think if you follow some of those European traditionalist or conservative accounts, you see news like that every week, if not every day.
But this case was very interesting because the attacker was this. Well, I'm not sure from where he was. I think it was Morocco, but I don't want to be to make the wrong judgment, and it doesn't matter in fact. But the thing is that exploded all this immigration and all that. But the thing is that the guy that saved this guy was just knifing people on the street and kids and their mothers and everything. The guy that saved the family was a motorcycle guy, and just started helmeting the guy with his helmet. He was Brazilian, so then you have a big problem there, because both of them are immigrants.
Are both of them immigrants? Yes. Well, that just shows you like the human spectrum, right? You have the Good Samaritan and you have the sociopath that attacks. But, I'm not a fan of open borders. I'm not a fan of uncontrolled immigration. But I feel like when people start criticizing that in certain countries that contributed to that refugee flow in the first place, which I think really escalated right with the Libyan situation and that NATO intervention there. You should really need to look at all the factors. Now, of course, there's also, European immigration or immigration into Europe thanks to its links to the former colonies, right? So that's a little bit of a different scenario. But it's obviously a very complicated, very loaded question. But I feel like whenever we talked about the subject, it's not like this completely black and white situation. I definitely, I'm putting this on record. I'm not a fan of just uncontrolled immigration. And I can look at this as a Russian, because we talked about the brain drain. So you're actually having a brain drain from another country. Now they might be coming out of a war zone, but eventually that war zone is going to be peaceful. And you're basically appropriating some people who are very skilled in a new place. And so it's a very multifaceted question. It's definitely not easy. I feel like when people talk about it, they just kind of reduce it to like, oh, it's the clash of religions, or it's, whatever other paradigm they like to use to explain it. But it's more complex than that. But yeah.
Much more complex. I'll give you an example. Some video that we made about the Israeli situation, someone commented in the video that putting Jews, Arabs, Europeans, and Muslims all in the same place, that's a time ticking bomb. But if you get to Brazil, and that's very interesting. If you get to Brazil, Brazil is probably one of the most mixed societies in the planet. Most likely the most mixed society in the planet. And it's almost kind of naturally mixed. So Jews, Arabs, Muslims, blacks, whites, Indians, they coexist in a place rather peacefully. Okay, again, for people that's going to comment here, yeah, but there's a lot of racism in Brazil. Yeah, of course there is racism everywhere. But it's when you come to Europe, and my wife is Latina, and she's a brown Latina. She's she's mixed. Her family is mixed, Indian, white, and black. So
she's being perceived differently, like on an aesthetic level. Yeah,
she has a darker skin, so she's immediately put here as African.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Wow.
And here in Europe, and the level of racism that she suffers here, it's sad stories. It's a very bad story. Not saying that also the entire European is completely racist, but the level of racism, she tells me, I never passed by these situations in Brazil. Because, I mean, if you pick an African, and if you go to TikTok or whatever, you're going to see a lot of Africans that go visit Brazil saying this. We go to Brazil, people don't look you weird. People don't look you like something different, you know? And, for example, if you go to Brazil, as you said, you could look like Canadian. You're Slav, but you could look like Canadian.
Well,
but
the funny
Brazil,
thing is that
when
I lived in Toronto, Canada, and I'm pretty pale, but also because I have some ancestry from the Caucasus, I tan very easily. So I do look a lot darker. So I have had random people ask who are not Brazilian. I have been asked if I'm Brazilian. So it wasn't Brazilians asking me if I'm Brazilian, but I've had that many times. So I could see how that would happen.
Yeah, so it coexists nicely. I mean, it's not perfect by any means, but the coexistence is okay. I mean, we have streets on Rio de Janeiro we call the Sahara, where you have the business from the Jews, from the Lebanese, from all the Middle Eastern parts. They are in the same place. We have a fast food for Lebanese food. Brazilian fast food, Brazilian Lebanese food.
Right.
So it's very mixed.
Well, Japanese Brazilians too. I know about that diaspora because of my interest in Japan. So I've definitely have seen and met sometimes in the past Japanese Brazilians. So yes, it's I'm aware of that too.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it just happens there. It blooms.
Well, I mean, I don't want to de-emphasize the persecution of Christians in the Middle East over centuries, but at the same time, the situation between the end of, let's say, 19th century, but also between the end of World War I, the Ottomans stopped controlling sort of the parts of the Middle East in question, and then France and Britain had their League of Nations, same difference it seems like these days, right? League of Nations mandates to control these large populations because the League of Nations deemed them unable to govern themselves, which also says a lot because when we had the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman empires collapse, many European really small states were really sort of propelled into statehood, right? And so there was this perception coming from non-Europeans that, why are these people getting their own states, but we're not? And there was obviously that explicit perception from Europeans that these people here, specifically in the Middle East, right, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, are unable to govern themselves, so they need our help as civilized Europeans, quote unquote, right, to control them. And it was until sort of World War II and shortly after World War II when more formal independence was attained by these states. But even in that situation, you did have a certain level of coexistence, right? So people from different religions and different cultures. Again, I don't want to completely de-emphasize the fact that Christians were not persecuted, very generally speaking as well. But in that time period, those people from very different cultures and ethnic and religious backgrounds were able to live in that same place and somehow function together until the late 1940s intervention, right? With we all know what happened, at the UN in the late 40s, and then of course with the establishment of the State of Israel. So yes, I think there are. It's not just this blanket. They cannot get along because they're from different cultures type situation. There are also particular state policies and international policies that were at play and are still at play that really prevent any type of cooperation, right? So
yeah, sure. No, that's one thing that I always talk to Dave about is that war. Let's put tribal war. Okay, let's go very, very low level tribal war. It doesn't go for too much long until someone realizes that that's just stupid. We are killing each other. We are wasting our resources, and I don't have to love you, but we can tolerate each other and just coexist as civilized people. Yeah, every now and then we're going to have some problems and some discussions, but going to war, it's not a long time project. It cannot be a long time project. It cannot sustain a society like that. And I think America is going to learn, the United States is going to learn it the hard way.
Yeah,
They are going to get very poor.
Since I am a Russian on the continent, I am going to self-censor myself on this subject, but I think we do see that there are some really massive global changes happening, and that unipolar moment, which was an anomaly, is definitely over. So, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I myself, I don't see that ever was a unipolar world. I just think that they fooled themselves into believing in this. But that's
well, in the grand scheme of things, it was 20 something years, which obviously, if you look at history from the Chinese perspective, right, they perceive their history as being like 5,000 years long of continuous history. That's just a little blip, right, on a timeline. That's really nothing. So.
And so this comment here is saying good night to you, and just that loves your country. It loves Russia since she was a young kid.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I was very curious. We should have gone during the Olympic Games. We were going to go to Moscow during not the Olympics, sorry, the World Cup. We didn't go. Right now, I would wait a little bit. In Moscow, I wouldn't have any issues. I'm pretty sure it's going to be. It would be safe. But you have to pick up a plane from here, go to Turkey, or go to
Turkey. Exactly, you have to go to Turkey or Central Asia, and it's just. I know people who are sort of newer parts of the diaspora and all their families back in Russia, so they kind of have to travel, but it sounds like it's quite an adventure having to go to a third country and then having to travel to Russia, and some of them are not from Moscow, they're sort of farther out. So yeah, it's I feel like unless you really have to or you're very adventurous, it might take some work to get there, but you can be satisfied by all the expat foreigner YouTube channels that show you life in rural Russia. They show you life in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's always interesting, by the way, to me to see these foreigners have different perspectives, and they're not really embellishing things. You know, if there's something that they want to criticize, they're going to criticize it. Obviously, it's, you know, it's their YouTube channel, and they can always go back to where they came from. It's not like they lost their passports. So yeah, I find that really interesting. So yes, maybe someday in the not so distant future, we can all go and tour all the sites.
That's a plan of the channel. At some point, we are going to make a big meeting with everybody that we are meeting in this journey, this new journey. Nina, we are going to 4 hours. This was a
marathon. This was a marathon. Yes,
It's 4 hours. It's 3:53 minutes. Jesus Christ. I think your
wife might be a little bit upset that you're
She's asleep for hours.
She's been sleeping. Okay. So.
No, actually, when we start the broadcast, she was working. When we start the broadcast, she arrived home and I had forgotten the door locked. So I had to jump out for a second to save her. Okay.
Well, so, this was a marathon. So
that was a marathon, and that was amazing. Call your friend Kavork Almasian, please. Tell him to come to our show. I'm writing him, and he is refusing to answer me. I don't like to ask these things, but you know, since you're here.
I will do my best. I will do my best.
It's very important from what I see, and
I've seen you. He's very knowledgeable, and he's very knowledgeable in things that I am less knowledgeable in. So I think that's definitely something that would be a benefit for you. Exactly. You know, he's very, very knowledgeable about very specific things in different countries in the Middle East, for instance, right, or certain other conflicts. So I think that would definitely be beneficial for both parties.
And even apart from the Middle East crisis at the moment, the Syrian crisis is very important for what we are showing people here.
Yes, so, yes, absolutely.
At some point, he's going to answer, I'm sure.
I will do my best.
No, you don't have to worry about that. If by chance you exchange some messages, say, hey, there are some Brazilian guys, you know, he's being a pain in your ass, but he really wants to talk to you.
You can do a double stream, right? You can stream onto each other's channels. I think that might work. So
exactly. We just did one with Larry Johnson 2 days ago with Commandant Farinazzo. It was pretty awesome. Another Brazilian channel. It was pretty awesome, actually.
I'm glad we're able to do this across time zones and across geographic divisions. So I'm not for open borders, but I am for open communication across right across countries. So
just to finish this subject about open borders, what I was talking about Brazil is that thing was organic. What happens now is just a flood of people with the cultures that sometimes are very different, and people fail to realize this. And many times, so for example, in Switzerland, they have a very strong program to integrate people to society. In Italy, it doesn't.
Well, you also need to have a strong culture to integrate into. So if you're very morally relativist and you're sort of not really a fan of your own roots, and there's really not much to integrate to, it's almost like, well, what do you expect them to do? They're going to maintain their own culture rather than integrate in something that doesn't exist anymore. So I feel like the spiritual, moral, cultural crisis in Europe is far deeper, and it predates this refugee flow. So in the past, I think Europe was able to integrate people differently because it had a stronger culture and a stronger identity. And I know, of course, a lot of people do talk about European identity at large and separate European identities, whether in specific countries or even regions of those countries. So that's also relevant. But And of course, there are caveats, right? There's a difference between urban environments and maybe more rural environments where people do maintain their culture a little bit more. But overall, I feel that this sort of liberal progressive ideology has really been, obviously quite damaging to maintaining what was left of European identity. So if you really don't have much to integrate into, it's kind of hard to expect people to do something that is really not there, right? Or to respect you when you're not really respecting yourself. I know it sounds very kind of bland, but if you're yourself going to be criticizing Christianity and Christmas, why do you expect them to respect Christianity and Christmas when you're bashing it in the media, on a daily basis, for example? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think if you have at least the basic, language, well, you come into this country, you have to speak the country language at least.
Yeah.
Language. You don't need to. In Italy, you don't need to eat pizza every day. That's not the point.
Right.
But you have some levels. You have levels of instruction. You have the level of language compatibility. So, for example, if you are from, let's say, Libya, Algeria or something like that, or Morocco that speaks French, it's easier to integrate to Italian language. If you have someone from, Nigeria or that speaks English, or some Arab countries that even the alphabet is different. It's very hard. So it's really not. They have this system of level of compatibility. Let's call it like that.
Right.
They have this system, but there is not an action over it. You understand?
I see. Yes,
they don't
I get
take
it.
actions over. They just put everybody in the same basket. So.
Right. Well, it's a very complex question. I mean, when I first came to Canada, I felt like I was pretty much fluent in English because I had been studying it for years with a tutor. I was exempt from all the Russian school English classes because I was so advanced. I was still placed into English as a second language classes with people with very, very different levels of English, people who were just basically learning, I have an apple, and people like me who could, read and write and were essentially fluent. But they did want me to change. I had a UK accent because I had a tutor who spoke with a British accent, so that was kind of funny to think of myself speaking with a British accent. I know it's awful, but you know what I'm saying? Like even Canada, which really is importing massive numbers of immigrants for better or for worse, and not really necessarily integrating them. There was really not a lot of distinction even back in my day between people, like linguistically, like people who were proficient and just needed a little push perhaps, versus people who really spoke nothing and needed very basic education. So it's probably, the problem is probably broader than the EU is I guess my point. So.
Yeah, no, sure. It's well, if you have a strong influx of immigrants, you have to take measures to at least integrate what you have.
Okay.
So, are we done today?
I think so. This was quite the marathon. Very interesting. I'm glad it was a natural. I'm glad it was a natural conversation, right? We didn't just talk about Stalin, Trotsky in the ice pick with your meme popping up for 4 hours, and we could talk about other subjects. I think that's it's nice to be able to share.
I have this one as well.
Where is it? Let's see
it's not. Well,
it's not popping up.
Toasty!
Yeah, this is.
Oh my gosh. Hello, Che Guevara on the t-shirts of cell phone liberals in North American countries. Oh my gosh. Okay. I like that. It's Justin Trudeau's dad. I don't believe that, by the way, but yes.
Someone asked that?
Yeah, every time you post a Fidel, I think I posted Fidel's video in the Soviet Union, there's always someone who is like, oh, Justin Trudeau, looks just like his dad, ha ha ha. So,
Really?
it's an ongoing conspiracy theory that...
I didn't know that.
Oh, you don't? Well, this is another rabbit hole that you might want to investigate in the middle of the night in Italy, right? This is what you want to, your brain is not going to rest until you go and look into this question. Why people think Justin looks just like Fidel, which I think is kind of not the best comparison, because Justin is kind of this pathetic manager type versus Fidel. Whatever you think of him, he was obviously very, at least, brave and courageous. Like, not a good comparison. So, but yes, this might be another tinfoil you might want to put on and investigate.
No,
but
I won't even waste my time on that one. The only interesting ones. Who killed?
Yes, exactly. Who really killed Trotsky? Yes. Well, thank you for having me. We can definitely do this again, despite the time zone differences and some other constraints. So,
you are always
hello to your audience.
So everybody, give a big like for Nina. And thank you very much, Nina. It's
from the
Nina,
Winter Latina, the Winter Latina. Nina, the Winter Latina. I should just change my screen name, and people are going to be very confused. Nina is no longer Nina Byzantina. Nina is the Winter Latina. I mean, it rhymes, so I might as well just accept it, right? All right.
That's pretty cool, actually.
Right. Well, thank you for having me. We'll do this again. Get some rest. And hello to your audience. I hope they enjoyed our very diverse, just very long discussion today. So I will see you very soon, possibly
I really
in another
enjoyed
episode.
this. Yeah. Right. Hopefully, you know that you're always welcome in our channel, and everybody that's watching this, in the description, there is everything you have to know about Nina, and everywhere you have the links to follow her work, especially on Twitter, the Twitter Queen. And thank you very much.
The Winter Latina.
The Winter Latina.
Yes.
The Winter Latina. Yeah, right. I'm gonna post this in the Twitter when I posted the video. The Winter Latina Twitter Queen.
X-Queen. No more Twitter. Elon might be not happy with us. Yeah.
The site formerly known as Twitter.
We don't want to be taken off X. Twitter, X. Right? All right. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.
Much.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon. Bye-bye. Do свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания. Okay, stop streaming.